But we took away from this. You're going to pay a bunch of hunters to kill does.
To load up Schwann trucks full of does.
And then you're going to load up Schwann trucks. I mean, that seems like the solution right there in itself.
Yeah.
And the phones are ringing at MDC.
HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Deer Grow.
Man, we've been using Deer Grow products for a long time. The Plot Start and Plot Boost, more recently Plot Till. Now we've got 3 new liquid fertilizers that have been put in the mix that will cover everything we could want for a food plot program.
It's huge, man. The more food plotting we do, it's like, man, the liquids just make sense. Like whether it's herbicides or the Plot Start and Plot Boost, and now the fertilizers getting mixed in. It's like, man, I can combine all of those in certain cases and do less passes for more results.
I mean, it's all about efficiency. I mean, like you said, less passes. If you're out there treating your beans with glyphosate in the summertime, you can mix in this fertilizer, do that all at once. You have the boost in there that helps the metabolism. It's all about efficiency when we're talking about food plots. And really the big difference on these liquid fertilizers is you're bypassing some of these soil limitations, pH limitations, the soil type. In a lot of cases, we talk about dry fertilizers only being available for 17% of what you put down in the first year. These liquid fertilizers straight into the plant are 90% available in the first year. Huge difference in what you're going to see in growth.
It's huge. And so right now you can use code HUNTR15 for 15% off any of the Deer Grow products on their website. And as always,
better food plots, bigger deer. And we're back.
Hey,
HUNTR Podcast, episode 204, as Nick for sure keeps us in line. Maybe a little squirrely the last couple.
Wheeling and dealing, boys. It's been, we're in the season now.
Yeah, you're leaving today.
Yeah, well, in the season of, whatever, even in the final moments here. But yeah, I'm leaving today for Nodex. So that'll
starts tomorrow.
Really kick things off. But dude, it's been a gnarly 3 days here. If anybody's been keeping up with us, we got back from Iowa Sunday night, and today is Thursday. So we had 3 days to catch up from the last one, me get ready for this next one, and I was telling Nick, honestly thrilled with the progress we've made here.
Had a couple presentations.
In 3 days' time. Oh, yeah.
We're gripping and ripping, nice. Man.
Yeah.
It's been good.
Got some new film equipment in it. I got a new GoPro I got charging here behind me, and I kind of started the thing off there on stories this morning for Rockin' to Nodex. So excited to capture all that. And yep.
Very cool, man. Weather looks okay?
Yeah, it looks pretty good. Today, it's gonna warm up, but they, in my opinion, today's the tail end of the front. So it's like high 70s today, but windy and cloudy. You know what I mean?
Classic Nodak weather.
Yeah. Somebody might jump the gun and be like, that's where we want to be. But tomorrow, Bluebird. Yeah, wind's gonna die down. 80, and then Saturday's the day. I think it's gonna be like 70, 76, and it was 44 this morning in Nodak. So we're gonna be on.
You'll hunt mornings and evenings, right?
Yeah.
Not tomorrow, obviously, but
nope. Starting Saturday morning.
Very cool.
Yeah. So Jack,
handful of days to get it done.
Shot the bow again real quick the other day. Just
tight, right?
Yeah.
Got her all packed up, ready for the airport.
Got the severs in there. Yeah, Margie was helping me jump on and off the scale last night with my bag, and got my custom gear lying in the bottom of the bag, and everything on top of it.
What was your final total on your bag?
50 pounds.
On the nuts.
On the nuts, yeah.
Yeah. Just like, that scale's wrong.
Yeah, straight 50. So I think last year I was a pound or two over, and they let me slide. If I have to, I can pull some more out and put in my carry-on. But
yep. Pretty cool.
Yeah.
Bows packed. Ready to roll.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we're good. We won't delay our guest here too much, because you and I are due for a You and I podcast at some point, just to catch up from...
There's a lot to get in on this one, though.
The whole Iowa trip. So real quick, the rundown. We got 13 sites, sets prepped, basically climbed 13, 14 different trees, cameras, mock scrapes, felt really good about all the properties that we're on. Have some good deer showing up already, potentially a few shooters even. Ended that trip with Mobile Hunter Roadshow at the DeQuisto's farm, which was
awesome,
fantastic. We were just felt like kind of guests of honor, which was awesome.
You guys would have just watched a couple of the podcasts from there.
Yep, good to spend time with those guys in the wolf den, otherwise known as Andre's living room.
Yeah, he's like, what do you call this? He's like, the living room. I'm like, oh.
Okay. I was hyping it up. I said, what do you call it? The wolf den or the wolf pack? He's like, it's my living room. I'm like, right.
Yeah. But really
sweet.
Yeah, it was awesome.
Yeah,
it was really cool.
It was cool. Really good turnout for that, and really nice to meet some guys too. Put the face with the name that we've been corresponding with on Instagram and stuff like that.
Buttoned up Illinois on the way home. just a half day, trimming some stuff.
Quick touch up.
Quick touch up. Yeah. And now it's like the work, hay's in the barn.
And tomorrow I'll be hunting.
Just like that.
So
we got a cool guest today, though. One that's by popular request, I would assume. You know, we've got a pretty big Midwest contingency that listens to this. And so we've got Jason Sumners on from Missouri Department of Conservation. And, you know, we'll let Jason kind of go through. But Jason's kind of gone through the ranks, you know, at MDC. And my wife, Emily, actually worked with Jason at MDC for a while. And so pretty cool to kind of see, you know, that evolution for him, but obviously also a guy who there's probably nobody else that I would say knows better about, you know, where Missouri's been, where it's going, where it is now than Jason. And so it'd be cool to kind of get his take on some stuff and a lot of questions, obviously, around Missouri when you talk about, you know, CWD and rifle seasons and rut.
You would almost call it a controversial state because of some of those issues. I think CWD and the gun seasons during the rut being the primary ones that come to mind.
Yeah, it's still producing giants.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's one of the you know, it's one of the cornerstone states as far as, you know, when you talk big whitetails. So it's not one that we have a ton of. Well, that I have a ton of personal experience. You actually lived in Missouri.
Yeah, I lived there for five years.
For a few years. So it's closer to your heart, and maybe we'll make it back there someday. But yeah, it'll be interesting to get into this one.
Yep. So let's bring Jason in. All right, man. You got us, Jason?
I got you, Phyllis.
All right, buddy. Well, we appreciate you joining us this morning from Missouri. And like you said, kind of this weird August weather. We're in the hot streak at this point.
Yeah, it's the false falls, right?
Yeah.
Like the anticipation of fall, and you get the 50-ish degree morning. You're like, it's close, and then it's 98 degrees 2 days later. So yeah, I think we're feeling it,
dude. It's seriously like in the Northeast here. We're coming off of like at least I'm gonna say a 10-day drought. I mean, you got 0.3 in Ohio, but it missed me.
Yeah,
I've got like a quarter. Like a 50% chance of a quarter inch this weekend, and then literally another 10-day forecast of nothing.
It's dry.
I'm like, I don't know how you come back from this.
Yeah, it's really dry. Yeah, I don't know. Seems like it's been like that the last 2 years in a lot of this area as well.
I know.
You know, and then we obviously are starting to get, we were kind of talking pre-podcast there, we're getting a lot of people talking about EHD, and you mentioned, like, obviously when I lived in Missouri, so I was there during like the 2012 outbreak of EHD in Missouri, Jason, and that was just like, it was kind of, besides being in Mississippi and dealing with it in the South, like from a death standpoint or mass death standpoint, it was the first experience I've ever had with EHD in 2012. I was hunting opening day in September, and like I think I found 3 of my target bucks like dead on public land, in a creek bottom.
2012 was, it was bad. It was epic. I vividly remember we had moved into the new research office, and around 4th of July, I came back from the holiday and was getting calls about folks finding dead deer, and I was like, this is bad.
Yeah, it's not good.
Finding dead deer in early July is really bad. Yeah, it was an unbelievable year, and that I don't know how many deer we lost, but we lost a bunch. I did some back of the napkin calculations, and there are counties that I think easily lost 20% of the deer herd, countywide at least. And then we had what at the time was nearly a record harvest. We shot over 300,000 deer because we had a massive acorn failure. So it was sort of a double whammy in 2012 that set the stage for this whole concept that we would never get on top of deer populations after long-term population increases. And that was a pretty challenging time in the deer management world. And Emily was right there beside us to work on that stuff.
Well, Jason, just
yeah, 1 sec. Yes.
That better? Yeah, there I am.
That was weird.
No, you're good. Jason, just for some of our listeners, give a little background on yourself. So, I guess obviously degree-wise on yourself, we both went to Mississippi State, so go Bulldogs. We know that. But you also spent some time in Texas.
Yeah, no, I did. I'm a Missouri guy from birth. Went to Mizzou, then had that, as you mentioned, the opportunity to go to Mississippi State, and and study under, Steve Damaris, which, so many folks in the deer community have had the opportunity to either study under him or work and collaborate with him or his products. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then had a chance to go to Texas, worked with Randy DeYoung and crew there, both through Texas A&M and Texas A&M Kingsville. Got, spent some time in South Texas working at the King Ranch and, seeing the way that management happens across the southern U.S. Because at the time I was also communicating with, the deer program leaders in Oklahoma and Alabama and Louisiana. And then in 2008, got a chance to come back to Missouri and really establish our private lands deer program. We were running on one deer biologist. Lonnie Hansen was really responsible for statewide deer program and recognized, the critical role of private lands deer management in a private land dominated state.
Mm-hmm.
And so really got the chance to stand up that private lands deer program, spent a lot of time working on, establishing deer management cooperatives and getting landowners to work together and really setting the stage for some of the things that we're doing today in terms of DMAP program and things like that. Yeah. And then in 2010, we found, CWD in a captive facility. And then 2011, we found it in the free ranging population. Things got pretty crazy. Same time, the commission asked us to reintroduce elk. And so they elevated me into the deer program leader position, moved Lonnie into an elk biologist position. That's when it freed up the opportunity to hire another private lands deer biologist behind us. And that's when I got the opportunity to hire Emily and work with her. And she was able to accomplish things in the private lands deer program that I wasn't able to. And so, that set the stage for, as I mentioned, just a minute ago, the changes in the deer population. We've been going through a lot of challenges. We went through a pretty massive update of our deer management plan in 2014. And that all kind of on the heels of, again, the emergence of CWD in the state. And I think back to those days, because now we're 10 years past having drafted that deer management plan. And now we're kind of in the process of reevaluating where we are, especially in the kind of the presence of CWD in many corners of Missouri. And around 2015, I got the opportunity to take over Wildlife Division, took over Science Branch, back to Science Branch a few years later. Then 2 years ago, stepped up into the deputy director role. And then in the beginning of June, the commission asked me to serve as director. So it's been a sort of a rapid rise in many ways. And I've only been here for about 16 years, but I think many of the challenges that you guys have been tackling around deer management have really honed my leadership skills and communication skills and things like that. And certainly prepared me to try to lead this agency through the next iteration of conservation in this state.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at it, and obviously not to like belittle any of the other stuff that falls under a commission or conservation group control, whitetail deer drives a lot of it, right? And it tends to get the most attention. It's the loudest voices in the room.
It's also wild how few guys there seem to be. It's like every deer program director, state guy that's involved with the deer program. It's like. Did you guys all have the same dorm room? Or it's like, there's such a small number of guys. It's like every one of us, like, yeah, we work closely with, the Texas A&M, the Damarises, everybody knows everybody. Is it really that small? Is my perception correct? Or
it's just about that way. Yeah. Everybody's laughing, but it is just about that way. And I think the other thing is, I took the time to listen to the interview you guys did with Mike Tonkovich. It's a close-knit community. I think there's, relatively few people who, short of the waterfowl guys, waterfowl guys are under a tremendous amount of, public scrutiny, public analysis as to what's going on. There's just not many roles that are quite like being the statewide deer program leader, especially for a Midwestern state in which deer are so important. And you're right, Jeremy. At times, I think it frustrates some people that so much attention gets spent on the white-tailed deer. But I also think it is, without question, for many of us in the eastern parts of the U.S., really the measure in which the public evaluates how effective we are doing.
Absolutely.
How effective we are in conservation. There's just no question about it. It's so visible, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're everywhere. Everybody sees them.
Yep.
Whether there's too many of them or too few of them, right? So I think it's just a challenging, really challenging species to manage.
Not just the herd numbers either, but the number of people who are involved in that activity. It's like, I think whitetail deer numbers, I don't have the statistic, but I have to imagine it outweighs waterfowl hunters by 20 times, 100 times.
Yeah. I don't know.
That's a lot more deer hunters than there are waterfowl.
Yeah, we have in the neighborhood of 45,000 waterfowl hunters in the state, and we have 450 to 480,000 deer.
There you go, 10 times.
And that's
I mean, I think that's the big thing when you kind of look back at it from a standpoint. And I guess Jason, you listen to Tonk's episode. One of the things we kind of were really pulling out of his episode, besides that people dynamic things, because there's obviously a lot of things that you mentioned the small group, like a lot of us. Because we can communicate, we can see things happening in other states that people are doing well or things that maybe aren't going well. And a lot of times we want to take those and apply them for ourselves, right? Because it makes sense. It's not that easy, right? There's a lot of obstacles because of the amount of voices in it to say, Tonk's sitting there saying, like, we don't have a DMAP program. Doesn't exist, right? When we know from the research, like, how critical and how important that can be to a herd, especially at a landscape level.
Well, I don't even think Tonk had known, whether you're in favor or against, like what Oklahoma is doing right now, like with the releasing of high fence for the CWD. That's how they're approaching it. I don't think Tonk even was aware of that. And so we got to bring that to his attention. So it's like, hey, you should probably know about this. And he was obviously super intrigued. But
yeah, there are things that work through the legislative process, right, which the Oklahoma situation did. And then there's things that as deer program leaders, that team and folks are communicating about and, have some awareness of. But I think it's also part of, there's just so many things going on sometimes that it is kind of hard to know whether it's something you ought to track, whether it's something realistic that might happen or not. And the other thing you guys, have also been, a couple of your more recent guests kind of tackling is the reality that all of these agencies are structured different.
Yeah.
Right. Their authority is different. Who makes the decisions are different. And we here in Missouri are extremely fortunate and extremely protective of, the Missouri model of conservation that was, in fact, created by the citizens. We were a constitutionally established agency and, by a vote of the citizens in 1936. And so, the governor appoints the commission. The commission really has the authority and responsibility to carry out the, protection, management, and conservation of the fish, forest, and wildlife resources of the state. And then that commission hires the director, right? I'm not an appointed by the governor sort of position. And in fact, I'm only the 10th director in the 87 plus year history of this agency. And so just that, ability to kind of see long-term and plan long-term and think strategically about what some of these resource management needs exist here in a way that they don't exist in other places. If you're, many of my counterparts across the country, the average tenure of a state fish and wildlife agency director now is less than 3 years.
Wow.
So just the disruption that creates within the structures of state agencies is extremely challenging. And again, you guys have hit on it. Some of the pressures that exist for folks that are appointed into those positions are just very different.
Yeah.
And the result of that is, like you mentioned, Jeremy, things that happen different in different states for a whole host of reasons that may be completely explainable or may not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I think it makes it really hard for the hunting public to say, well, Missouri's doing this.
That's exactly what it
doing
is.
That.
Yeah.
And Oklahoma's doing this. What in the world's going on? So they think the deer biologists have very, very different views. But when you talk about it, we have some different thoughts on how things might get carried out. But many times the range of variation isn't necessarily because of the desires of the management staff within those agencies.
Yeah. Jason, since you mentioned or bringing up the structures and stuff, can you help us understand how do things happen in Missouri? Like if in terms of how does a change get implemented? Where does an idea generally come from? Like, is it from listening to the public via surveys? Is it somebody within the department, or like more of a top down to say, hey, we'd like to see this change? And then what's the process that something goes through to get executed on?
Yeah, honestly, it can be all of the above. It can be a request from the public. It can be things that we consistently hear from the public. It can absolutely, and many times comes from Jason Isbell, our deer program leader now, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, hey, we need to make this adjustment. Let's move this through the process. And so the commission has the authority to promulgate rules. And so they really are the decision maker in that frame in terms of seasons, limits, anything that involves the take of fish, forest, and wildlife, or the management on our public areas. So a rule will, get its way to that team, right? That team really is the one that our deer program team will be the one that will roll it around, and they'll draft language. We have a internal regulations committee that is chaired by the deputy director of resource management. So the role that I held previously, that really worked, with all of the branches across the agency. They work very closely with our protection staff, right? To say, okay, if we craft this rule, this is something that's defensible, it's enforceable, here's how we would do it. Mm-hmm. And then it goes through a rulemaking process, a formal rulemaking process through the Secretary of State, the formal public comment. One thing we do different here, though, is most of the time, we do a lot of public input on the front end of ever proposing something to the commission, right? So we'll take it to the commission, but it usually includes, surveys, right? So like right now we're thinking about how we're updating our deer management plan, as I mentioned, and where do we go with CWD management in the state. We sent out over 100,000 emails to our hunting public to receive survey, get survey information, and really kind of quantifiable information. And that's been a cornerstone of this agency for a long time. Mm-hmm. We had hired the first social science of any state fish and wildlife agency in like 1978, mm-hmm. right? So using public input has been an absolutely critical part of it. If necessary, we'll do public meetings, we'll do open houses, we'll do podcasts, we'll do the WebEx kinds of formats to get input, and then take a recommendation to the commission. They have the opportunity to say, hey, let's move this forward, let's not. It goes out for public comment. Public comments, required to be a minimum of 30 days. We get public comment. Through that process, sometimes things get missed, right? It's like, oh, hey, what about this? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of another chance for the public to say, hey, what about this? Then we have to take that back to the commission and say, here's the public comment we got. Hey, here we recommend staying the course, adopt as written. We're recommending a tweak. Staff recommends an adjustment here. This wording was a little confusing, or we missed this thing. Mm-hmm. And as long as it's not a major change, then they can choose to finally adopt that, or they can choose to repeal it. And that has happened a time or two, right? They're like, nah, we're just not comfortable kind of moving forward. So that's really the way the process works for us.
Am I understanding that correctly? In that it's fairly similar to Ohio in that they have the commission. How many? It's essentially like a board. You're talking about the commission. How many members are on that?
Yeah, so we have a 4-member commission. They're appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Senate. They serve 6-year terms, and no more than 2 of them can be from the same political party. Although that's never really been an issue. I mean, right. For the most part, conservation-related issues are nonpartisan. It's just some of the philosophies in which folks operate under. That's the way we're structured. And again, they get appointed by the governor, and then they really have that constitutional responsibility of carrying out the mission mm-hmm. of the agency. Mm-hmm. We got to comply with rulemaking kinds of things, but the legislature really doesn't have the oversight of, especially the rulemaking process, as they would in other states.
That's what I was going to ask, Jason. So beyond the potential appointment or I guess confirmation of those commission members, the legislature really isn't involved in much else as it pertains to the regulation and things for the agency side of things.
Yeah. Short of the fact that we are part of government, and they're part of the the branches of government, and so we don't we try to be very careful in that authority and that responsibility and being transparent. So we do, they appropriate, funds for the agency. And so we go over every year, talk about what's in the budget.
Yep.
We've got staff that are over there communicating what it is we're trying to do, what it is we're trying to accomplish. They can be an avenue for the public to reach out and say, hey, I got this issue or this challenge. Can you guys look into it? Can you think about it? Hey, would a regulation change be appropriate? Would some sort of an agreement be appropriate? So we work very closely with the members of the legislature. So it's not like we're just like at arm's length and never see them, none of that. That's absolutely not the way to do good government. But from a rulemaking standpoint, it really is the independent commissions authority.
Because of that, we've talked to a lot of different, whether it's TONC or in Pennsylvania and these other ones, there's a lot of lobbying going on in the legislature because of how much influence they have on rules and regulations. Do you guys see less of that in Missouri because of the way you're structured?
Yeah, very much so. The Conservation Federation of Missouri really is the organization that it's an affiliate organization, so it's sort of the umbrella organization that convenes a lot of the NGOs and other interested parties in the state. And we work very closely with them, communicate with them a lot on, a number of conservation related topics. And they're sort of a conduit and avenue for folks to communicate with us, but there's always an open door policy, right? And I think that's part of it too, is we're always open and receptive, value, input of others and are trying our level best to make, good and well-informed decisions. And so I think when you're able to do that and we're able to remove some of the political maneuvering that happens, it lessens the need for lobbying, right? It's not like folks don't have their own little, things that they're very much interested in. We're not afraid to talk to folks about it. It's like, what is it? What exactly is it that you're trying to accomplish? And can we find a way that makes sense? But then we really do rely pretty heavily on, the discussion around surveying and trying to really quantify where our public stands, because, we as humans tend to think that everybody thinks like us. And it's really, really hard in those kinds of conversations to really understand whether a conversation you're having with someone reflects a broader community or whether it's something that's really a burr under the saddle of that individual. And so, like I mentioned, we rely heavily on surveys to really quantify that information as we make decisions. And that happens continually.
Yeah. That survey that you're mentioning, you mentioned an email list of like 100,000 people, and maybe there's more, other avenues of people that you're tapping into as well. But that list specifically, are those license holders? Is that the people you're surveying there?
Yeah. So we survey permit holders. Unlike some other states, if you're going to chase deer or turkeys, or pretty much anything, we have very few, very narrow exemptions from having a permit.
Yeah.
And so, we're also pretty mindful of trying to make sure that when we survey that we're surveying them representatively, right? So we will weight that survey to say, hey, there's, X percent of our deer permits are resident landowner permits, right? So let's try to make sure that proportionally they make up a similar proportion in the survey. The other thing is we can sometimes pull out, by permit type, how did folks respond? The other one we do, and I think you guys talked about this with Mike Tonkovich, he talked about the production landowner survey. That's one we've done for a long time. As well, in terms of that quantifying too few deer. I was like, yeah, Mike and I, we've done a lot of things very similar from that standpoint. In terms of trying to gauge public opinion. But we do that across all of our fish and wildlife species, right? So we annually survey all of our waterfowl hunters, and we're in the 5-year season setting, getting ready to kick off the 5-year season setting process for that. And so that'll not only be surveys to hunters, but that'll also include some workshops, right? Some workshops about what do we want to do? How do we want to move forward? So we do try our level best to make sure that information we're getting is representative of all of our hunters across the state.
Well, the reason I asked the question is Jeremy and I both realize that, hunting is not everything, right? There's a lot more people that weigh into the deer herds and the hunting seasons even than just
from a stakeholder
from just hunters from a stakeholder standpoint. So I'm curious if you were to run down through a list, whether it be from lobbyist groups or, interests of the commissioners or from the surveys that you're getting, who are the primary stakeholders that influence, deer hunting and deer management in Missouri?
I mean, I think the big ones are the hunting public and agricultural interest to a large degree, right? And I think, at least in the recent history, if we can find that middle ground where there's not too many farmers pissed off that there are too many deer, there probably won't be too many hunters pissed off that there are too few deer, and you're probably kind of in the right spot. And if we're in that spot, then we're probably not hitting too many deer on the highway. And so they're certainly interested. On the local scale, though, as a state, that has a couple of, large metropolitan areas, certainly local communities that are dealing with, those urban and suburban deer problems influence them, that local environment. But we got to kind of deal with those in a different way than we do, sort of statewide management approach. But for the most part, those are the primary stakeholders.
I mean, that makes sense. Some other ones that have come up that people are like, well, it seems like it, but we don't know, would be like insurance groups, always get mentioned, well, insurance companies are paying for this or that, and that
deer vehicle collisions,
ties into your deer vehicle comment. And the other one would be like, crossbow lobbyists, or you could just generalize that and say business activity. It's like, we want to leverage the hunting season to make more money. Would you call those guys stakeholders as well?
Yeah, certainly. I guess we don't necessarily get them lobbying us. Folks will perceive that they did. Right. 2014 through that process, we went through and expanded the archery season to include crossbows. I never once was contacted by any of the crossbow manufacturing companies or archery trade association or anybody like that in an attempt to say, hey, you guys should have crossbows. So there are these narratives that people use to justify why they don't like something and why somebody did something. But for the most part, we don't have those sorts of influences. And I'll even say, a lot of states, the Farm Bureau is a place where, a lot of communications about, hey, there's just, it's for some landowners, production landowners, there's one deer is too many.
Right.
But we worked really hard with the Farm Bureau to build relationships. And we go over there a couple times a year, not only talk to their leadership, but talk to their advisory council and just talk about, conservation related issues and be very open and transparent. Even to the point that a few years ago, they had questions about that production landowner survey that we were doing. They're like, yeah, but you guys are using, anybody who's got, 20 acres and claims they make $1,000 off the property, right? So we modified some things about the way that we did the survey. And they actually, we helped them craft a survey that they sent to their farmer members so that we could compare them side by side and say, hey, okay, no, this is great, right? Let's understand what your membership is saying and how it compares to the survey information that we got. And it was pretty revealing. I thought it was really interesting. In fact, they had slightly more, folks who would respond and say, hey, there are too many deer, but not to the extent that I would, say we would have dramatically done something different.
Yeah.
And then it also helped us sort of weed out that larger, especially really large production landowners were the ones that had the most sort of dissatisfaction with deer numbers. And again, I think that's a reflection of the challenge of managing deer on large landscapes, right? And so if you don't have a lot of hunting pressure and you're not taking care of those things across a large, portion of the landscape, you're going to have challenges, right? So it made a lot of sense. So it was just a really turned into a really non-confrontational way to talk about deer management challenges. And we've been then talking with landowners, production landowners that are leasing land and frustrated, right? That they still got too many deer because the guys who are leasing it only want to shoot big antler bucks. We're like, look, guys, you own that land.
Yep.
You can ask them to do something different. There's not much we can do different from a management standpoint. And so
or you don't have to lease
just
it. You can open it up
engaging
for
and listening to folks.
Yeah.
Just engaging and listening to them gives you an opportunity to have these non-controversial conversations.
Yeah. Well, I think it just reemphasizes the structure that MDC has and kind of how it flows within the government. It's a massive advantage to what a lot of these agencies are having to deal with super agency wise, and, very heavily looked over by the legislature and things like that. When it's not that the stakeholders aren't having conversations, which you clearly are, but in a lot of cases they're having conversations above your head and it just comes down,
Right. We're having more collaborative and constructive conversations, I think, than this is what's going to happen, and figure out how to make it happen. And then the teams in those states are forced sort of explaining or justifying why that happened as if it was their idea, which could be really hard.
It is. Yeah.
The HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Hoyt.
What can we say, man? Another year back with Hoyt. We're both shooting RX8s. I'm shooting 70 pounds in the bourbon, which I love bourbon.
It's great.
And you're shooting 80 pounds in the straight black.
Blacked out as always, man. I got so I'm shooting the 500 grain Easton Arrow this year. And at 80 pounds, I'm flinging that thing at like 300 feet per second. I mean, it's deadly. Put a water buffalo in front of me and he's done.
I mean, we shot it earlier. You literally put an arrow through a brand new target, like never been shot before.
I know. So one other thing that Hoyt is doing this year is they're making all their own strings in-house. And so the quality is top notch, and it just really is something that is setting them apart from their competitors.
Well, what we always try to do when we go to our bow shop, Ultimate Outdoors, is we try to shoot other bows just to make sure that we are really giving everybody a fair chance. Sure. The reality is it's a no-brainer. Hoyt stands above all of them every single time.
Definitely. And so right now you can use code HUNTR, HUNTR, for 20% off any apparel on the Hoyt website. And as always,
get serious, get Hoyt.
It's really interesting to hear. We can go down as far down this road as you want, but your perspective on saying that you were never contacted by lobbyists from crossbow groups, which obviously I believe you at your word. But I know for a fact that like in Iowa right now, because it's one of the last holdouts on that issue. There's a hell of a lot of lobbying going on from the crossbow companies, and I know that from people that are fighting it internally. It's like, it seems like that is the thing that is flipping that switch for most states. And so if it wasn't in Missouri, I'm curious, maybe how you guys came to that conclusion to include those.
Well, a lot of it was just sort of the continued decline in participation that we've been seeing. But, there's no doubt that we have fewer hunters on the landscape today than we did before. In some ways we have fewer acres for them to hunt. There's no doubt about that. But that baby boomer generation has been aging out. And, we know from a lot of our archery participation, we get, dropout happens a lot faster, especially once they start hitting, 50. Dropout happens really fast during the archery portion. And so part of it was, how could we provide additional opportunities for young hunters and kind of keep some of these chiseled veterans sticking around a little longer. And as we looked at, where the impacts of crossbows in other states and, the slow shift in participation, from vertical bows to crossbows and stuff like that, we have a deer population that could sustain whatever potential increased harvest was going to occur from that. A lot of it we expected would be shifts out of firearms harvest to folks,
sure,
when the weather's a little better, if they're going to increase participation. And so that was really the motivation behind, allowing crossbows. We could allow it. It'd give folks additional opportunity. And then we had some, folks also don't think about the fact that we had exemptions, right? We were issuing 35 or 40,000, exemptions, a huge number.
Oh, wow.
That all took our staff time to do it, right? Like it took it took more than one full-time employee just to process all those exemptions.
I bet.
Yeah. That's
sense. Resources we couldn't allocate to somewhere else. It's like, man, it's just, not only from a management standpoint of the herd and, the opportunity for hunters to have additional days in the woods, but from a resource allocation standpoint for the agency, it didn't necessarily make sense either.
Well, so that was, he said 2014. So we're 10 years now after that decision to include those. Has it helped did it achieve the goal? Was participation increased because of that?
Yeah. So what we've seen is an increase in archery participation from older hunters and from younger hunters. And when we look at harvest, we do ask them, did you kill this with a vertical bow or with a crossbow? And, our harvest is about 50-50 in terms of the number of deer being taken with a crossbow versus a vertical bow. And we've not really seen a dramatic increase in total archery harvest. There's been a slight uptick with some of that increased participation. But yeah, I think by and large it's been successful, and we don't hear anything about it anymore, right? Folks are
they're numb to it at this point.
Fully accepted that it's there, and we're moving forward.
So 10 years over, you'd say that the archery harvest is fairly comparable to what it was 10 years ago before the introduction?
Yeah, it's on the same sort of slow trend it had been on before, with just general increased participation in the archery portion. I think that we see in a lot of states, right? Mm-hmm. Folks picking up a bow, they can hunt earlier, they can hunt a little longer. So nothing, no real substantial change that required us to make adjustments elsewhere, right? So I think that was part of the fear too. That was like, well, if we start shooting all of our bucks, or we see a really significant shift because of crossbows, that means you guys are going to change something on, the gun hunters or that kind of change. And we just haven't had it. The proportional harvest looks very similar between crossbow hunters and vertical bow hunters. And so, I think it's been a good change.
Has gun season harvest changed at all?
Gun season harvest, it's for sure. It has slowly declined, quite honestly, as we've seen a little bit of the shifts out. Yep. This year's a little different for us. We shot our record harvest of 326,000 deer. Part of that was because we increased some opportunities. We had an early October antlerless portion. We had a cold front in October and shot some additional antlerless deer, which we absolutely needed to be doing. Mm-hmm. And then we created a CWD portion, which effectively extended our main firearm season in our CWD management zone counties. And that resulted in some increased harvest. So this year, I don't know if it's an anomaly or not. We'll find out. But we did have, certainly had an increased harvest. And it's a little hard to, folks say, it's a record harvest. It's not necessarily something we're celebrating. Yeah. It's because we got a lot more deer on the landscape than we have before. And in some places, we certainly need to stabilize deer populations.
Yeah. And so you guys made a change. When I was living there, Jason, we still had the $3 rule. And then at some point that changed here between 2015 and now. When was that decreased down to $2?
Yeah. So that was part of that writing of the deer management plan that we did in 2014, 2015. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, where we, folks could take 2 with a bow and 1 with a firearm. Only one of those deer could come before the November portion of the firearm season, right? So you can only kill 1 archery deer early. We asked all those questions, right? I know where this is going. It's like all those questions about what does our hunting public desire out of their deer population? Yeah. And, we floated the question of 1 buck, and holy cow. It was not popular at all. I was quite shocked, right? Yeah. I mean, we'd had an antler point restriction in place for, a decade in a number of counties at that time, 6 years in a whole bunch of other counties. Certainly the, rising interest in shooting larger antlered bucks, but our hunting public just was not at all in favor of, this idea that you'd restrict my opportunity to shoot a deer with a bow and shoot another buck with a firearm, and likewise shifting the season back. Yes, there are certainly folks who desire to do that, but they still represent the minority of Missouri deer hunters.
Interesting.
And part of that's tradition, right? Things are hard to change, but at that time it was very clear. And so we continue to ask those questions through time to see if there have been major shifts. And while we certainly hear anecdotally from folks that very much desire to produce an older, more mature age class in the population. Now, all of our survey data suggests that there's still a strong desire to kill a buck.
Yeah.
Right? And it doesn't really matter what it is, and don't limit my opportunity to do it.
It's an interesting dynamic because, like, obviously with this podcast and a lot of just the way that we kind of, talk about things, we hear those loud voices kind of saying like, oh, we need to move that gun season out of rut and into December, just like so-and-so or just like so-and-so. And for understandable reasons of why they're looking to protect younger age class bucks and to, basically get it out of the rut so they're less vulnerable to a point.
And in fairness, like you said, anecdotally, most of the people we're talking to are people who are interested in shooting big antler deer, residents and non-residents. I mean, that's our primary who we're having conversations with.
Yeah. So I think that's where it's easy to put the blinders on for that kind of a group, to think that that's what everybody wants.
And it would be helpful to understand that, like, the basis of a lot of what we try to get at, and if you listen to that podcast with Tonkovich, it's trying to understand and tease apart the difference between like quantity and quality, and maybe there's a layer of herd management that ties into that probably would work more in favor of the quality standpoint. Mm-hmm. Say, hey, we want a healthy age structure, which also is going to produce big antler deer. But I also realize that we are by far the minority of guys who are just
opportunistic looking. Yeah, most of them.
Well, people will categorize us as trophy hunters. Yeah. They say, well, that guy just wants to shoot big deer. And I realize that most people just want to have opportunity to shoot deer. But so we want to believe that you could have both. So like on the issues of like crossbows or season dates, whatever it is, run down the length. How do antlerless harvest is a big one. It's like, how do we make all these stakeholders satisfied with the number of deer that are getting harvested while also giving people who want to shoot big deer the opportunity to have a healthy deer herd to do so?
Yeah,
loaded statement and a question. I know.
Yeah, if you figured that out, let us know.
I'd appreciate some feedback on that. But no, I think assumptions are made, right? There's just all sorts of assumptions that are layered into these things that. In many ways, our desires and our actions don't necessarily line up. Another thing is that we see the survey results and they say, well, 25% of the hunters say they only will ever shoot a large antlered buck. Well, that's what they say on a survey.
Yeah. Same with the $3 thing. Same with the $3 thing, right? It's like when those guys were like, oh, I'll never have it. You're like, well, only 5 of you have ever shot $3 in a season, so.
Right. So that's always a challenge too, right? To see through what really happens on the landscape. And then, one of these things that I think we're also challenged with is a recognition that we did and do have and would still have large antlered bucks on the landscape, even if we had fewer deer on the landscape, right? It's about those individual decisions. And so there's just some of these reluctance, to bring populations down for fear that there won't be as many numerically. Right. There will still and could still be, large antlered adult bucks on the landscape. My father-in-law shot one of the largest bucks taken in Benton County in, the early 1990s when there were far fewer deer, right? But the giant deer. So those sorts of things exist, and it's finding that happy medium. And I'll be honest, I think, we saw declines, through the mid 2000s, around that 2010 to 2012 period. We were seeing high conception rates, but relatively low fawn conception rates, right? So an indication that we had deer numbers that, while they were not necessarily detrimental to sort of the standing, crop of bucks on the landscape, but we had too many deer, right? Yeah. Like that was an early indication there were too many deer. We still had high conception rates in yearlings and adults and good survival and all that kind of thing. But an early warning sign, this landscape, while it can support we probably had too many. So we bring deer numbers down, those fawn conception rates start to go back up, an indicator of better herd health.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the part that gets missed is we are measuring herd health now by the number of large antlered bucks on the landscape and not really some of those other indicators.
Yeah.
So that's the part that I worry about. And especially as we have a shifting hunting public that is increasingly, less likely to shoot antlerless deer, more likely to hold out until they shoot a buck. We just have more and more deer on the landscape, and it makes those things super challenging.
No doubt.
So what are we doing, right? We can have fewer deer and still have a really much, in some cases, a much healthier population.
No doubt.
We kind of saw that after, that kind of devastating EHD outbreak in 2012, like subsequent years, we had less deer on the landscape, but there was more resources, more space, less social stress. We saw some giants being produced at that time period. So I guess, Jason, kind of looking at that, because really, whether you hunt Iowa or Illinois or anything like that, we kind of look at Missouri and say, okay, you guys, you got 500,000 deer hunters. You got a fairly liberal season, especially with the gun season and when it kicks off.
Probably the best habitat in the country.
Yeah, you got a two buck limit, and like you're still, you still have too many. Like you're producing too many deer still.
Oh yeah. We are right at that spot where in most places we would say we got about the right number of deer, but the deer population is increasing.
Right.
And so it is like trying to pull all these levers. There are no more levers to pull,
right,
to get folks to shoot antlerless deer.
Yeah,
for all the things you guys have been talking about in recent podcasts. Of I'm going to hold out until I shoot my buck, and then I'll shoot a doe, and then it's the end of the muzzleloader portion at the end of December, and I still haven't killed one yet. You know, so it's a challenging conversation, and I think that's why. That's why these, the discussion around the decline of hunters is only compounded by this changing preference of what they desire to shoot.
Yeah.
Just have folks who are, there's a lot of barriers standing in the way of the folks shooting a lot of antlerless deer today.
Well, what's weird about it is like, is like we've talked about this before, like it seemed like in that, say early 2000s through, 2010, 14-esque time frame, right? Really that QDMA type push where it was like, hey, 1-to-1, 2-to-1 type buck to doe ratio like that, or doe to buck ratio. Like that's our goals. That's where we want to be. And that's really kind of faded away here quickly to where people, people aren't looking at managing their antlerless herds on their property. They're just like, hey, if I get a chance to shoot some does, great. If not, I'm focused on taking a mature buck anyways.
That's true.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's sort of what I worry about. And it was a worry, we had around that 2010 to 2012 timeframe that, some place in Missouri, we were shooting, 1.6, 1.8, almost 2 antlerless deer per antlered buck. And we really significantly shifted the sex ratio of the herd, right? I mean, the composition of the herd in a lot of places really shifted as a result of that. And that was done partially by design, right? If we were going to see deer hunter declines, we needed a deer population that was structured that way, where we had fewer does on the landscape and in the long term had to shoot fewer does to maintain this herd in balance.
Right.
Well, yeah, now you get hunters that shift away from that willingness to shoot additional antlerless deer, and you have potentially declining hunter numbers. You're back to this struggle of how in the world are we going to manage, a deer population. And again, I say that, saying that, in a lot of places we got very robust deer numbers. We're not dramatically out of whack. We got these other tools like DMAP and things to address, localized issues. But you're right. We got a liberal season, and there's really zero space to add days, because additional days doesn't necessarily equal additional dead deer.
That's right.
And all of those things. So it becomes a playing on the psyche of the hunter. How do we figure out when they're going to actually shoot an antlerless deer versus this strong desire to be out there all the time to shoot antlered bucks?
Yeah, that's exactly right, dude. That is one of the biggest management questions, in my opinion, is how do you get hunters excited about shooting antlerless deer? Because I think, over the past, 10 or 15 years, as changes have been made with season dates and bag limits and stuff, it's like, and especially tag numbers, I think we have a pretty good understanding now that opportunity is not going to equal necessarily like the harvest objective that we're after. It's just going to give guys more time to shoot big bucks, which is what they want. And now they have the time with basically crossbow season and whatever. You could run down the opportunity list to occupy properties and not shoot quote unquote deer, but just have a maximum time and opportunity to shoot what they want, which is big bucks.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And it's the acres that are getting held up because, well, one person might, come hunt there. And then at the end of the season, you're looking at a place that hadn't had any does harvested off of it or has had one or two harvested off of it. Yeah. The additional days, I'm all for providing as much opportunity as we can, and we should, right? I mean, there's no, reason to try to limit, folks' ability to harvest deer. The flip side of that is that it creates additional days to procrastinate.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think
the deer seasons and regulation. Yeah, the deer seasons and regulations were designed at a time in which we were protecting herds, right? Our philosophy is about protecting herds and managing harvest in that way. And we just are not there today and haven't figured out how to sort of shift that paradigm.
Well, here's an interesting dynamic for you, and I don't know how you put this cat back in the bag, but like I personally feel that crossbows in the archery season are one of the biggest reasons for loss of access overall in states that have allowed it. Because I can obviously see and relate to the original idea, which is, hey, we have declining numbers. Let's give them more opportunity. It's like you said, it has not increased the harvest in the way that we had hoped that it would. Maybe it stopped the bleeding there for a while, but what it has done is it's brought all these gun hunters into the archery season and given them a reason or an excuse to occupy all of these properties that now essentially we can't influence with management. They're locking them down, they're surveying them, and they're only trying to shoot big bucks. So that's kind of how I feel about crossbows in the archery season.
Yeah, and I think that might be the case in some other states, where you have a much higher proportion of your deer hunters that do participate in the archery season. We're still sitting at about, I don't know, maybe less than a third of our deer hunters, actually participate in the archery season.
Oh, wow.
The vast majority of our hunters participate during the firearm.
That's a huge difference.
It is.
Compared to toms.
That's because they can hunt in November with a gun, probably.
Probably. Yeah, I'm sure it is.
Yeah,
it's absolutely the case.
Yeah,
which is part of that argument too. And I'd love for us to have a giant antler buck behind every tree. The flip side of that is, what's wrong with putting the most amount of hunters out in the woods when it's the most exciting time to hunt?
Yeah,
that's sort of the other side of it too. And from a herd health standpoint, it's not detrimental to the herd. Could we produce more large antler bucks if we push the season back? Yeah. Would we change participation as a result of that?
Probably.
I mean, it can get pretty cold and nasty here in North Missouri in December. It would change participation. There's no doubt in my mind about that. And so there's trade-offs and consequences to all of those sorts of decisions. But yeah, I do think the it's not low. I mean, we got a lot of very passionate archery hunters. But we have, my perception is that we have fewer of them that are method specific, passionate people, right?
Yeah.
I think we still have a lot of folks that are going to pick up whatever method is legal during whatever portion.
Yeah, they're opportunistic on the season side of things. Yeah. I
from
think,
a method standpoint.
Yeah. So, Jason, when you start talking about the antlerless stuff, and I mean, we kind of had this conversation with Ohio and some other states, but, people point a lot to Wisconsin and say, well, earn a buck, right? Especially in a multi-buck state, right? You can't really do that in a $1 state. That's tough. But in a multi-buck state, what if you kill your first buck or you kill doe, whatever you want out of the gate, but to get that second tag, you got to shoot a doe.
Was that Wisconsin that they have that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can kill you just buy your first one over the counter, but to earn your second buck tag,
there are a lot of issues with it. Like we just talked to a guy recently where he
carries over.
Yeah, he's had carryover, and some of it's tied to CWD positive testing. We'll get into that, but yeah. So I guess just in thoughts on that, clearly you're surveying these people who are like, listen, you're not cutting me down to one. We're not, but in order to get that second, you got to.
The root of the question being, how do we incentivize doe harvest?
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, that's the challenge. I think there's a couple things operating, and we're starting to hear from a few more folks that say, hey, we'd be open to that idea of an earn a buck. And I think maybe it's Virginia or one of those states too that's sort of starting to play with that. Virginia's down to, I think, like 180,000 hunters statewide.
Really? Wow.
Oh yeah, right. And so that's the cliff that many of us are worried about falling off of. And when you need to harvest, in the neighborhood of 150,000 antlerless deer on an annual basis or plus, we still need a pretty robust hunting population to accomplish that.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I think some of those things are happening and discussions are starting. Not necessarily here, but it's in the what's in the toolbox for us to use.
Yeah.
To try to incentivize that. Another thing that doesn't. It might seem like a small thing, but one of the things that we're certainly trying to work on is that I think a lot of hunters would shoot more antlerless deer if they had an easy place to go with them.
Absolutely.
Right.
Oh, we would. We would.
Well, I misheard you there. The first part, there's two things there: an easy place to go hunt them and a place to go process them.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I think, that's one of the things that we're going to really start emphasizing is working with our Conservation Federation on the Share the Harvest program.
Yeah.
We've seen the decline in participation of a lot of rural meat processors that, they'll take deer on opening weekend, but as soon as the freezer's full, they're done. Or
they're done.
They're only taking boned out meat. It's just lots of forces in the system that are pushing back against folks being willing to harvest additional antlerless deer.
Dude.
And I think you're right, Jared. I think there are folks out there that if they had access would be more than happy to go shoot a couple does. And that's one of the things we saw with our early antlerless portion that we started last year. A few of the NGOs actually were able to get on some of the DMAP properties that we have. And they're like, hey, if we bring out new hunters to shoot some does, you guys good with that? And they were just kind of surprised the overwhelming support that they found. And actually they're going to increase some of that participation. So there's no doubt there's some pent up desire to shoot antlerless deer by some folks who don't have, the high quality access that others might have. It's just figuring out how to navigate that.
Can you, how does Missouri's deer season lay out? When does it start? When does it end? When does the gun season overlap?
Yeah, so the archery season begins on September 15th. It will run through the beginning of the November portion of the firearms deer season, which is usually the Saturday closest to the 15th, so long as it doesn't overlap with Thanksgiving. Will run for 11 days. We now have an early antlerless portion in nearly every county that is around Columbus Day. So it's that kind of second weekend of October. This will be the second year for that. Our archery season doesn't close during that time, but properties are open for antlerless harvest. And then we have a late antlerless firearms portion that comes in after the November portion.
And when is that roughly?
It's in the kind of the first week of December.
Okay.
Time frame. And
can you shoot
an alternative?
Can you shoot an antlered buck during that time too, or is it antlerless only?
It's antlerless only unless you have CWD management permits, and we can talk about that later.
Sure.
And then we have a late alternative methods portion, which is muzzle loaders, handguns, that really runs for, again, about 11 days, right around Christmas to New Year's.
Yeah. I think that early December, antlerless only season is probably the most intriguing. What kind of participation do you see in that?
It really depends. We kill, 17 to 20,000 antlerless deer during that time frame. It's sort of the procrastination season, right? It's like, yeah, we didn't shoot them during the November portion, but again, this is part of these things that shift hunters' behavior. They're like, well, I still got 2 more weekends. If I don't kill a doe during the November portion, I'll go out and shoot one then. And again, we still do have, a hunting public that still has at least a reasonably strong desire to shoot antlerless deer, so we get those done. One of the things that when we added the October antlerless portion that, I kind of, questioned our team pretty hard of, what's the impacts of that going to be? Is it going to be additive, or are we just going to shift?
Yeah.
Are we going to shift antlerless harvest out of these other time frames? And at least last year, it does look like it was largely additive. If you look at where we had been in terms of the trends of harvest during those various portions, folks went out and shot some antlerless deer, which is great. The challenge we hear, from adding those, we have a youth portion that occurs, 2 weekends before the opening of a firearm season, is that it's slowly eroding away the number of firearms free days during the antlerless portion, right? Or during the archery portion. So we certainly hear some of those complaints.
The HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Lone Wolf Custom Gear.
Man, Jared, we are tree stand fanatics, and I think the one thing that we have learned over all these years is to kill big bucks, we got to be mobile. We've been hunting out of Lone Wolves for many years, the original Lone Wolf, and then obviously with the custom gear stuff, we're using the 0.5 and the 0.75. Yeah. And the one thing that we talked about is like, what if there were no cables? Here we are.
I really just don't know how you can beat it, frankly. But, a lot of that came, too, from a relationship that we've built with the DeQuistos. We've had both Cody and Andre on the podcast a few times. The passion for hunting, the outlook on the sport and stuff, I think is eye to eye with how we look at it. Everything that has gone into building this brand and to building these tree stands is something that we want to be a part of.
This is the 40th anniversary of these guys creating tree stands that have been critical to how we hunt whitetail deer today. If you look over the past, you'll see Andre's designs being implemented across so many stands over the years. Such a cool thing, but really has changed the way that we all hunt whitetail deer from above now.
Right now, you can use code HUNTR, HUNTR, to get 7% off anything on the entire website. Be the lone wolf.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it sets up well. We've kind of reflected a couple times here. At one point in time, well, for a long time, Pennsylvania was essentially a 2-week buck-only gun season, right? That started the Monday after Thanksgiving and then ran for the next 2 weeks. And then following that, we had a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday antlerless season. And, growing up, I just remember, everybody was buck hunting, right? But then the moment that doe season kicked in, it was like, World War III out there. Because nobody really archery hunted, all right, before then. And then, you couldn't shoot one during the rifle season or gun season. So that was really the first time for the majority of hunters to be able to get meat.
I was going to say, you think that's primarily meat driven?
Yes. Yep. I think it was meat driven. But I think it was also opportunistic driven, right? Because there was no crossbows, or you had to have a permit exemption. So archery participation was fairly low in the 90s and into the early 2000s.
Sure.
Then you had no concurrent seasons at that point, right? Buck only gun. So it was the first opportunity. So it's one of those things that we have this conversation all the time, Jason, where it's like we want to believe that opportunities is going to get us to the goal that we're looking for.
Results, yeah.
But oftentimes it seems like, man, if I reflect back, was that restriction really driving more harvest? Because if I look at the antlerless harvest then versus now, it's very similar, and that was a 3-day season versus how much opportunity we have now.
Yeah. The human psyche is a strange thing, right? and the way that we go about making decisions, we are an inherently irrational species that has a great ability to rationalize things,
especially deer hunters. Yeah. You're spot on.
So, but yeah, you're talking about the limitations. It takes me back in time. I think I was high school or just about to go into college, and we had a system here where you had to send in to draw on any deer permit, and then depending upon the unit you were hunting, you may get 1 bonus or you might get 2 bonus tags. And then we went to like I call it like Black Sunday or something. I don't remember the exact date, but we shifted to a way that hunters could go get their antlerless permit from a permit vendor, and the perception that they were somehow going to run out.
Yeah.
Caused the whole system to crash. There was like massive lines at Walmart at like midnight for guys to buy these crazy Antlerless permits that were actually available in any number, right? You can only buy 2 of them, but but we were going to issue any number of them, right? And it just like this perception around somehow there's limitations, and we see these rushes on toilet paper, whatever it might be, right? That like is these psyche things, and I think that's sort of where we are, and in many ways it's like really uncomfortable too, because it's like I hate to feel like we're having to try to figure out how we influence the motivations of a hunting public, right? When really, the desire is, hey, we got these number of deer we need to get killed. How do we get them killed? I don't care what you kill them with, as long as you do it ethically. So what does that look like? But that's really what it feels like we're doing today. It's like, well, if I do 2 days here, will that motivate them because there's some perception that they'll do something different later on? And it's just a tough spot to be in.
Yeah, you don't know. I mean, it would literally have to be trial and error, right? Just to your point, like looking back at last year's numbers, it's like, this seems additive. This was great harvest. Was it a fluke? Well, we don't know. We won't know until we do it again, right? And repeat it multiple times. And then was it a weather factor? Like, there's so many things at play on that. It's hard. And this is where, like, I think a lot of the general public, like, they'll look at, and I'm one of them, right? Like, I've been asking our game commission for Sunday hunting harvest numbers, specifically isolating the Sunday numbers to say, hey, are we really, like, is Sunday really that impactful, or are we just taking it from other days? Because that's kind of been the general consensus here. And it's like, you need to have some trend data there. You need to try to isolate the variables as best as you can. But ultimately, you got to do something, right? You have to make a move and implement something.
Yeah, it's tough. I think there absolutely is when you got really, really few number of days, adding days does matter. But when you got lots of days, when you're going from, I don't know, for example, 24 days to 27 days, you may really not be making a substantial difference.
Yep.
Depending upon, the timing of the year, and what's available to be harvested. But yeah, that October portion, we hit a nice cold snap. It was the first time we'd done it in a long time. We had an old Urbans portion that was that same weekend. And if it was warm, nobody went. We didn't kill anything. If it was cool, folks went and killed a few. So in some ways, it was the excitement about a new opportunity, and then the weather aligned.
Yeah,
it's like, this is perfect. But if it's warm this year and folks are like, well, I don't know, I still got lots of days to hunt. Will they still be as motivated? Yeah. So I don't know. I really don't know.
It's a tough one.
I don't have the answer, but I can't help but feel like we overthink it sometimes. It's just kind of like, what do deer hunters want? And it's like, okay. And then what are the management goals? Okay, so how do we get them to take the medicine before the sugar? And I don't think earn a buck is necessarily, like, that's the easiest answer probably. And maybe some form of that is incorporated.
It's a loaded answer, but yeah.
But yeah, how do we get them to earn it and not walk away? Because that's at the end of the day, we can't have that. We got to keep the hunter numbers, but how do we get our management objectives accomplished by incentivizing them with what they want?
So Jason, the 2 buck tags that somebody can get now in Missouri, one of those is archery. Is the other one strictly firearms, or can I move that to late archery like the old tag used to be?
Yeah. So when you go to a permit vendor and you purchase permits, or you get them online, you're going to get 2 any deer permits with your archer's permit.
Okay.
And you can buy 1 firearms any deer permit.
Gotcha. So it's a combination of 2.
Yep, it's a combination of 2, just that no more than 1 with a firearm and no more than 1 prior to the November portion of the firearm season.
Got it.
So if you shoot 1 with a bow early, you can shoot 1 with a bow late, or you can shoot 2 in the same day after the November portion if you want to, with a bow. So
yeah, interesting. And no real benefits for a landowner. Like we have property in Illinois. We've got now a non-resident landowner archery tag, and then our statewide archery tag. No benefits like that in Missouri.
Well, landowners can get the landowner of 20 acres or more of a resident landowner, 20 acres or more, can get an any deer permit, archery any deer permits.
Okay.
Non-resident landowners of 75 acres, 80 acres or more can get the same.
Okay. But still only one before the gun season?
Still only one before the gun season. And it's no additional buck harvest.
Got it.
The buck harvest limit, regardless of how many permits you can get. The flip side of that is those any deer permits can be used on anything. It's not like they can't use them. They can use them on whatever they want to use them on.
Sure.
So just like Illinois, it's two maximum.
Yeah.
And you got to own more than 80 acres as a non-resident.
Except in Illinois, we can kill both in bow season early. We can't in Missouri.
It has to be after the gun season.
Yeah, one after the gun season.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So yeah, it's interesting because I don't have a good answer of how to like spiral around that. You're right, Jason. It's the psyche of the hunter of like, you don't want to. You're trying to follow all the deer data and all the harvest data that's given to you, but in reality, it's just what's going to trip their trigger to make them actually go out there and do it.
It sounds like you're doing a lot of things right, too. The fact that you guys have designated antlerless seasons is something we talked about with Tonk. I'm like, man, that seems like it would help. The other thing which you mentioned is, that frankly, we want to be a part of promoting, or it's like, I think we have some ideas on it too, but it's promoting the processing portion of that.
Like the hunter sharing the harvest type style.
Yep. And promoting on podcasts, working through taxidermists. If guys want to shoot big bucks, but you got to incentivize them with, especially if there's an earn a buck, it's like, dude, work those processes through taxidermists.
Well, and
stuff,
I know it's sketchy, but we brought up the Tonk about like, because of the decreasing on the private side, it's like, is there a state-run facility? Like from a processing side, you think about the number of meals that can be provided.
Here's a crazy one. Tell me why this won't work. What if you paid guys to shoot does? not like state, like sharpshooting type stuff, but paid individuals from the public for turning in does?
Well, I'm quite surprised this came up, but I'm telling you, this is something we're talking about, or we need to start talking about, is this idea that, and it's not gotten serious, but it's like at some point we need additional deer removed from the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And absolutely, hunters are critical in our ability to manage whitetail deer population. But at some point, some of these states, they don't even have enough hunters that are willing to do that.
Yep.
Right. There's a management objective. We need to remove X number of deer off the landscape on an annual basis.
Mm-hmm.
And how in the world do we accomplish that? And so there's some folks that are really concerned and thinking long term. This isn't a new idea. It's been floated around there for quite some time, that, this North American model, the idea that we don't sell, game, and that, it can only be taken for legitimate uses and those kinds of things, is a place where folks sort of just push back. It's like, no, we can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not saying there isn't ways to do that reasonably and responsibly, right? A lot of those thoughts and philosophies were at a point in time where we weren't dealing with overabundance either.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't dealing with the massive habitat fragmentation that exists today. There's no shortage of deer on the landscape.
Yeah.
And so how would we go about doing that? I have no idea.
Yeah.
But it is something that folks are starting to really bring up. And when we look at, the impacts that whitetail deer have on eastern forest in particular, the ecosystem level impacts that deer can and do have are real.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can't manage the population at a sustainable level with the hunting public, it sort of forces our hand, right? I mean, we would love to have the ability to do that with the hunting public. But if we end up in a spot where we just don't have enough hunters left on the landscape, and they're certainly not willing to harvest a sufficient number of antlerless deer, then you find yourself trying to think about what can we do to incentivize or even pay for.
Well, you hate to like group them in the same like nuisance category, but you think about like some of the old like coyote bounties and stuff that were being paid. The guys were going out and just smashing as many coyotes as they could, and they were getting paid whatever, a $25 bounty on every coyote that they took out. And maybe this is where the transition happens in this conversation, Jason. We've had a lot of people, just because we've mentioned you were coming on, and per this conversation, it kind of clouds it, because I'm not sure I understand their question now. Is like a lot of them will say, when we talk about the CWD areas and we talk about some of the sharpshooting type stuff that's happened there, they're like, man, I really wish they would use hunters to shoot those deer and collect those deer. and I guess the question would be, are hunters just not harvesting enough deer in those areas from a sample side, or is it more from what you all are trying to sample in particular that I don't want to say they can't be trusted with, but you know what I mean? It's just a more specific harvest.
Maybe a baseline would be helpful too. Like, what's the CWD situation in that northern part of the state, and how is it being addressed from a harvest standpoint?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. There's a lot tied up in that. And so I would say, yes, we are doing everything we can to involve the hunting public in assisting in management and the localized approach, right? So many of the liberalizations that we've done to the hunting season are, again, that attempt to give folks the opportunity. So, we found CWD in the free range population. The first deer would have been detected in the fall hunting season of 2011. And we started, targeted winter removals in the winter of 2012 in a very small area right there in the Lynn-Macon County corner.
Yep.
In 2014, we found it in Adair County. So for the first time, sort of outside of that little pocket. And since then, we found it in a number of additional counties. One of the things that we have been able to do, because we had a really robust sampling and surveillance program that began in the early 2000s. 2002, 2004, we collected, I don't know, I don't recall the exact number. It was like 25,000 deer statewide, right? It gave us a really good baseline that if the disease was present in Missouri somewhere, it was present at a very low level. And so it really continued that surveillance through time. And so, we continue to detect the disease in a number of new places each year. But every time we do, it is at very, very low prevalence. And so what that has allowed us to do is be very surgical in our approach. So I think about this, and, you hate to equate, CWD to a nasty human disease, but like cancer, right? So like all that screening, all that consistent screening early on has allowed us to detect, the first signs of a tumor, right? The first signs that something's going wrong. And then go in and be very surgical in that removal, right? So shooting deer within, a mile or two of those initial detections, right? We're not trying to eliminate all the deer in Macon County. It's like that's never going to be possible, not desired at all, because we want to maintain a healthy and stable population. It's really going into those spots and saying, hey, right here, is where a positive was detected, and that's where you're most likely to find another positive detection. And I don't know the number, but it's like, if we kill a deer within a mile of a previously positive deer, it's like 5 times more likely to test positive than any other deer we test in the state, right?
Wow.
But I mean, this isn't rocket science. It's not hard to understand. They spread it to each other. And so when we identify those locations, we define a core area. And so a core area is a 1 or 2 square mile buffer around that section where the positive was found. In that, we do those winter removals, which we work with landowners. It's completely voluntary, right? We don't have any authority nor any desire to force landowner to participate. We basically ask them, do you want to participate? If you want to participate, here's, from, January 16 to March 15, here's how you can do it. If you want to remove deer, we'll come pick them up. We'll test them. We'll get them processed. We can grind them up. And if you want them back, we'll give them back to you. If you don't want them, we'll donate them to share the harvest. And so we have, a number of deer that are going into share the harvest, but they're only the non-detect deer. And then there are other options. Say, I don't want to mess with this, but you guys can come in and shoot some deer. And then we ask them, what do you feel comfortable with? The size of the property. We try to be very respectful of their desires. If you want us to shoot, 10 antlerless deer, we get to 10. We come back and say, hey, we killed 10. You want us to shoot any more? We'll shoot some more, right? And so in some ways, some of these big landowners are like, well, we'll just let the MDC guys come in and shoot all the antlerless deer we need them to shoot. We don't have to worry about messing with it during hunting season. So some of that has definitely happened. The other thing that happens is during the hunting season, those landowners inside of those core areas have the opportunity to obtain additional permits, CWD management permits, which allows them to take any deer. That statewide buck bag limit no longer applies.
Gotcha.
So if they have that CWD management permit, they can take additional antlered or antlerless deer. And we got a kind of a formula in which we initially allocate those, but they can certainly request more. That gives them the opportunity then to say, hey, I got a couple guys going to come up and hunt, during this time frame. They might shoot some extra deer. We can allocate those permits to them. So it very much is that trying to work with the hunters right where the disease is. Mm-hmm. We have more liberal, county specific regulations for those that are in the CWD management zone. We don't have the antler point restriction, which is a little bit controversial. We don't allow the placement of feed and minerals.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have, you can't shoot over bait in Missouri anyway,
mm-hmm.
But we don't then allow those sort of recreationally putting out food and minerals. And they get added to sort of that most liberal package of antlerless permits, antlerless season, those kinds of things. And so that's really the approach. And it's about trying to really target the places where we have the disease and the deer that have been most likely to be exposed. We get a couple sections where we haven't detected a positive deer in 2 or 3, 4 years. We slowly pull back from those. There's no reason to keep shooting deer there if we've likely removed the positive individuals. So the goal is to just find ways to remove more infected deer more quickly than they can infect other deer.
Yeah.
And so it's just a numbers game. And so far, we've been really successful. Our prevalence rates, you look at our prevalence rates, and they're extremely low.
Mm-hmm.
The map looks kind of ugly, right? It looks ugly because we're finding additional detections, and it is absolutely slowly spreading. And then it's certainly having an impact on our ability to manage, prevalence of the disease. But there's no question that we're slowing down the spread. And then again, we've been doing this for nearly a decade. And as we talked, we just set the statewide, record for both antlered and antlerless harvest last year, 326,000 deer. So the 45 or 100 or so additional deer that we're removing as part of those targeted removals it's not having an impact on hunters' opportunity at a large scale.
HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Spartan Forge.
Dude, maps. Mapping, right?
Yeah.
It all starts with a map, a visualization of a new property, into the fine-tuning of different food plots, different habitat projects, where those are going to go, all the way to sharing pins and looking kind of like beyond the layers with something like a LiDAR, which is exclusive to Spartan Forge as of now.
Yeah, and whether we're looking at it from a management side to put in food plots or switchgrass, or if we're taking a run and gun public approach on Kansas, it all starts with a map. It starts with a strategy there. You and I are going to have our own Blue Force team, which will allow us to run our own devices, but be able to see what you're adding or what I'm adding to that single map, which is really going to be critical moving forward this hunting season.
That's right. So if you're looking for a mapping software to try out this year, or maybe you're just like not getting what you need out of the one you're using currently, Bill's offered us a promo code of HUNTR20, HUNTR20, that you guys can use to get your own subscription up and rolling. Check out Spartan Forge, download the app, use that promo code, and we'll be using that this year.
Make sure you check out Spartan Forge.
I mean, I think that the disease to relate it to would be COVID, right? Because there's a lot of questions about like how it actually affects, like how lethal is it, and that's everybody seems to have a different opinion on that and stuff. But so if we make a decision that, hey, it is lethal and it needs to be addressed, then the next question is, okay, we've implemented these measures to harvest deer out of it, and the question after however long we've been doing that is, has it accomplished anything? And so it sounds like your answer to that initially here is that the spread has slowed, which again was same goal as COVID. I think that it's interesting because what we hear is obviously the horror stories, like the rumors, right? We're because we don't know, we're not there, so it's like the picture in our mind is like, well, okay, MDC is setting up with giant corn piles and sharpshooters and thermals, and they're just annihilating it for miles and miles, all of northern Missouri, like it's been decimated. And so it's interesting to hear it's it's targeted in the sense of, a square mile is not small, but it's not the entire state either. Do you have a number? I mean, do you know how, if it's a mile at a time, like how many square miles you guys are currently addressing?
Oh gosh, yeah, I don't have those numbers at the
no worries.
tip of my tongue. But it's grown substantially in the last several years, just because we've had additional detections. But each time we detected, again, it's been at relatively low prevalence. One thing we did do this year that was a little bit of a shift to, again, try to communicate what exactly is actually happening on the landscape was within each one of those core areas, we actually established a removal goal, right? When we looked at, sort of harvest trends and what do we think the population of deer in that area looks like, we need to remove 5, or we need to remove 7, or we need to remove 10 deer per square mile, in addition to whatever this might look like, right? Mm-hmm. So 10 might be on the high end. And so within these core areas, we set those goals. And so we communicated that to the core area landowner, said, hey, look, this is where we are post season removal, where we kind of part of it based on history of what we've been removing, and part of it, what was accomplishable, and then went to the landowner, said, hey, if we can get to this number of, 250 in this core area, we're done, right? Let's get in there and let's get this thing done, and then we'll come back. And so that in and of itself has been, I think, pretty successful, especially in some of the newer core areas of getting increased landowner participation to just go out and shoot a few deer. And so it allowed us to go to some spots and be done in a couple of nights, quite honestly, with some high landowner participation. And so just really trying to do the best we can to more effectively communicate that really, early on in the stage of the disease, with any disease, you hope to eradicate or eliminate it. I mean, I think we know with wildlife populations, that's extremely difficult, nearly impossible to accomplish. And so you're just really trying to do everything you can to minimize it. Unfortunately, the narrative has been all these things that we take away from the public or from our hunters, that, well, you can't do this, you can't do that, now you can't do this, as opposed to, really realizing that in very early stages of these infections, we can have some impact, right? Let's go in and let's get after it for a really short time period. But through time, what is it going to take to sustain this population in the presence of CWD? And I think we can do it, right? I think it's just going to look different. Yeah. And we have to think differently about the way that we hunt and the way that we manage these populations.
Jason, what's the testing for hunter harvested deer in these core areas look like? Are every deer subject to testing? Like, or is it mandatory, I guess?
All the deer that we remove during targeted removals get tested. It is not mandatory. One of the things that we do to support landowners in their, removal efforts is we do, in fact, if they remove a deer on one of these CWD management permits and actually have it tested, we'll assist them in processing fees, right? So a little bit of that incentive to do that. But otherwise, we've got a list of counties that we do mandatory sampling on opening weekend of the November portion of the firearm season to continue to monitor the prevalence of the disease in those places and identify new spots. But not all of them get tested, and not all of them need to be tested. That's another one that's a little bit of a pet peeve with me, is that excuse me, we have unfortunately, we do need testing, we do need surveillance, and we need consistency, but we don't have to test every deer, right? It's a numbers game. It's a probability. There's a prediction, in terms of when and how are we going to detect it. But sometimes we send the impression that testing and surveillance is management, and it absolutely is not. It informs management.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that, because when you hear like a lot of these guys, they're basically saying to the point of even last year, right? Or, hey, we've MDC shot 4,500, whatever, 10 of those tested positive. It's like, 40, 490 shouldn't have been shot, right? That's kind of what the public, says, right? And so I think being that, we're a decade into this in some areas, that question is what Jared and I hear a lot from guys in the northeast part of Missouri is like, how many do we actually need to shoot per this testing and trend part data to, keep going down this research path?
I would say in tandem with that too, as like research has revealed that some deer have naturally occurring, genes that may cause them to be resistant to CWD, that we could be shooting the solution.
Yeah, there's a lot tied up in that question too. I guess, one thing at the core of that is none of these deer are wasted, right? Like this is it is a renewable resource, and we're not yet running out of deer. So I get we want to be part of the solution, but it's not in a lot of ways. It's not impacting a lot of harvest opportunity for a lot of hunters. The flip side of that is if we do nothing, there's enough data out there that we know that it kills deer, right? And we're starting to get plenty of indications that, especially in whitetail populations, some of the numbers coming out of Arkansas are pretty staggering, quite honestly, in the survival rates of infected deer, the force of infection that is occurring in some of those places. But it's happening in such robust deer populations that we're a long ways down the path of actually seeing on the ground population declines. But you look at the things that have happened in parts of eastern Wyoming and in parts of Colorado, where it is cropping off the older age structure of bucks, and so we know those sort of long-term impacts are likely. So, but it takes time, right? It's not just a snap of the finger. It's not an EHD outbreak where you suddenly see your cohort of 3.5, 4.5-year-old bucks dead in the pond, right? It's not that. It's a slow drain. It's like this slow trickle, and we're trying to slow that trickle down as fast to as little as we can, right? So that it affects as small of a population and as few a deer as possible, so that we are able to continue to maintain a pretty robust and healthy population. And that's really where I think the rub sort of comes, and it's a numbers game, right? How many deer should we have on the landscape, and how do we manage this thing? So we're working with a number of researchers, some folks with USGS, to really start to try to put together some pretty robust population models and try to predict that out through time. What might it look like if we do remove 30% of the antlerless deer on an annual basis, or more or less, right? How could we manage these prevalence rates through time to try to get to this point where I don't think any of us now believe that CWD will eliminate the deer herd, right? I think it just is likely to result in a much younger age structure and fewer deer on the landscape and less surplus to harvest.
Yeah. When you guys implemented in some of those areas the removal of the antler restrictions, did you see an increase in buck harvest? I mean, were there people kind of pent up that they were ready to shoot the first buck that they saw?
Oh, heck yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. When we removed the antler point restriction in Macon County, I was at one of the meat processors on opening weekend. We'd had the antler point restriction in place there for 8 years, I think. And so that was one of our big questions, right? It's like, has hunter behavior changed, or was the antler point restriction changing their behavior?
Right.
And I said at that meat processor on opening morning, and it was like yearling buck, yearling buck, yearling buck, yearling buck. I mean, I was like, holy cow.
Yeah.
It literally, when you look at the demographics of the harvest and the age structure of the harvest, it flipped right back to like it was a South Missouri county that hadn't had the antler point restriction instantly.
That's wild.
And so, again, that's back to this idea that somehow, it pushes back against the idea that a lot of our hunters are really desiring to shoot only large antler bucks. Again, I recognize that was 10 years ago, 12 years ago.
Yeah,
and so that shift has slowly happened. But yeah, I think there was no doubt about it The other thing is, as we've removed the antler point restriction in a number of these counties, we have seen a pretty substantial increase in buck harvest. But part of that's because we have more bucks on the landscape than we ever had before, right? And so it's opened up some additional opportunity for that to happen. I do want to get back to the question around, shooting potentially genetic resistant deer.
Yeah.
I think all of the information suggests that, there's no immunity, right? They just delay exhibiting, signs of the disease. And that during that time frame, they're still spreading CWD prions on the landscape. So it's one of these questions of, is it better for the deer to live a couple years longer, yet spread prions across the landscape a little bit longer in terms of population level impacts? So it's this question of, if we remove them, they exist at relatively low. So those resistant genotypes exist at relatively low frequency in the landscape.
Yeah,
extremely low.
Why is that? Why is that? We don't understand what might be operating from an evolutionary selection standpoint that has caused them to be, relatively infrequent on the landscape. So it's an easy narrative to say, oh man, you might be shooting the ones that'll be part of the solution. Well, I don't know that they're necessarily part of the solution. Usually disease management, it's easiest to handle diseases that kill the host pretty quickly, right? Not these that slowly trickle out. And then we're talking about hundreds or thousands of generations for these things to typically operate, especially when you're at relatively low prevalence in the population. And so I guess I just, I don't know that that's when folks have sort of tried to model out some of those things, I think it's one that certainly in the short term and likely in the midterm, probably not a good strategy, which is why we have questions about the things going on in Oklahoma, like the idea that we could introduce some genotypes into this very robust population and shift the genetic structure of the herd, really speed up evolution, right? Could we speed up evolution?
That was my question to Seaberry. Like, we had Seaberry on here not too long ago, Jason. It'll drop a podcast or two before this. And like what he says makes sense. I mean, overall,
the primary difference between what Jason's describing and what he told us was that these deer with these genotypes do not contract it.
No, they do. He said that he danced that question. They still get it.
We'll have to listen back to it because that was one of our questions going into it. I was like, well, okay, so is it just delaying it? Or are they not contracting
they're
it?
more resistant to it, but they still get it. No,
that's definitely what he said. He said their odds of contracting it are much lower. Therefore, they're not spreading the not that they can't get it, but that they're much lower. That's what he indicated the research was.
It really seemed like those deer were just, because he ended up tying that back into EHD. And it seemed like those deer are just healthier deer. Like that's what it kind of came down to. Is maybe it is many gene related, or the alleles that he was talking about, but it just seemed like overall those deer were healthier. Which, if you think about it, like as a healthier human, like, COVID might not affect you as much as it affects somebody who isn't as healthy.
Well, sure, but he wasn't just saying healthy deer, are less likely to get it. He's like, deer with these specific genotypes. Yeah, if they're healthy, that's obviously going to help. That's going to be like your 80% that shouldn't get it. But he's saying this genotype is much less likely to get it, and therefore is not spreading it. That's the basis that, and so because we asked him, we're just like, hey, what was your, you had this thing in Oklahoma, and he basically was like, no, I had nothing to do with it. I produced the research, and the state of Oklahoma took it and said, hey, we want to apply this to our deer season.
Yeah, legislatures.
Yeah, I think too, some of that work is revealed. You guys talk about all the alleles. I think it's a very complex relationship, right, as to what that resistance really is, and it's not, necessarily clearly understood. It's not like we're selecting literally for one allele on one gene.
No.
It's a very complex relationship, and selective pressures are acting on all of those, and fully understanding what the impacts of those are. I don't know that we fully understand that, but I wish it were possible. I absolutely, and I hope, I think through that work and as many, brilliant minds working on this really gnarly challenge, we'll start to better understand, what the impacts of CWD are and how best to manage them. But as wildlife managers, we got to deal with the here and now. You know, this is where we are. And if that is the case, you know, if we come up to a therapeutic, if we come up to some other, you know, better solution, you know, our ability to implement that on the landscape scale is going to be a heck of a lot better if we got relatively few deer with the disease on the landscape now than just waiting, you know, waiting
sure.
For the to continue to spread. And then the flip side of that is there's this, you know, and a few folks, you know, Brian Richards and others have sort of, you know, talked about and we're seeing the reluctance of hunters to hunt in places where CWD is really prevalent,
Absolutely.
right? Like sort of the ick factor, right? Like I don't want to go hunt in a place where literally if I flip a coin, that buck's likely positive, or in some cases worse than that, right? Yeah. And CDC saying, you know, we shouldn't consume them. I think there's relatively, you know, little risk, but, you know, we can't say there's no risk of a human ever obtaining CWD from eating an infected deer. But, you know, this idea that, you know, part of the way we got here and the deer being so important to us socially and economically is because, man, a lot of us like to eat those things. I love eating them. I love sharing them with family and friends. And yeah, it's certainly nice to shoot one with a big rack on it. At the end of the day, boy, I sure enjoy some jerky and deer loins and all that kind of stuff. And so we got this extremely valuable resource out there on the landscape that man, I'm sorry, guys. I don't know what's going on. That if we do nothing, you know, from a food value standpoint, it starts to decline, you know, so how can we shift this narrative to, at the end of the day, I think most hunters still care about having a really healthy deer population. And I think we can all agree on that, right?
Yeah, for sure.
How we get there is the real challenge, and where all these individual values as related to, you know, what it is I hope to get from that deer herd sort of start to pop up and is the really challenging space to find middle ground.
I think the CWD hunter dynamic thing is something that nobody's really talking about that much. So I'm glad you brought that up. We had a conversation with a guy from Wisconsin this past weekend, and we were just, you know,
shout out to Barber.
Yeah, Eric Barber. We were shooting the shit, and he's like, yeah, I've got 5 buck tags in Wisconsin this year.
3.
I'm like,
3
or 3. Yeah. I'm like, what do you mean? He could get up to 5. And he's like, yeah, you know, I shot bucks last year that tested positive for CWD. They give you a new tag, and it's good for the remainder of that season and the full next season.
He also said he couldn't remember shooting a deer that didn't test positive for CWD.
So, like, all of a sudden, not only, number one is, like, let's say he can now go out and kill at least 3, if not more, bucks this year, right? It's like none of those deer are we asked him, we're like, did you eat ever? He's like, no, I didn't consume any of these. So that immediately is changing.
I wouldn't either, frankly. I wouldn't eat a CWD
I mean,
deer.
it just, again, to Jason's point, I think there's low times, but you see, I mean, what was it? Was it USA Today that put out the article this past
deer
year?
Zombie disease.
And like they said that there were 2 guys who subsequently ate a CWD deer supposedly, and then they got Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and they both died. And I mean, that freaks people out immediately. It just, that's a devastating blow to this. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, that changes the dynamic.
Even from a hunting standpoint, like if I can choose to hunt non-infected deer versus a hunting, I just I don't know why, I'm just going to hunt the non-infected deer if I can.
And so we see that with the distribution of non-residents, right? Because non-residents don't necessarily, they're a little more opportunistic in finding another place to hunt. A lot of our resident hunters hunt the place they got because that's where they got permission to hunt, and they got access, or that's where they own property. And so it starts to impact those. And, you know, I don't, not to be, you know, sort of doom and gloom here, but, you know, I always kind of looking forward to the future of what does this mean? And, you know, whitetail deer has been so critical for success of conservation efforts across North America, especially when you talk about private landowners valuing, you know, having these things on their property and the opportunity to chase them, and, you know, the millions and millions of dollars of habitat work that happens on an annual basis that benefit a whole wide range of wildlife species. We don't talk about that, but that's all on the back of the whitetail deer, right? You start de-incentivizing folks to doing good things to manage deer. and manage habitats that are sustainable, then all those other species sort of start to fade to the wayside because we don't have that private land, the recreational landowner valuing it. It gets, it gets dozed down and turned into fescue pasture, right? Or gets turned into subdivisions or other things. And so I guess to me, that's not to be doom and gloom, but at some point we got to recognize the real conservation impact that the whitetail deer has had in North America.
Well, yeah. And I mean, I think you pointed out Arkansas. I think Wisconsin's the other one. Like if you look at the prevalence rates in those areas, they're in some of those cases, they're extremely, I think Tennessee also has one that's pretty high now. Those are the ones you're watching to see, like, whether it's hunter dynamic changing of like, I don't want to hunt diseased deer herds, and or, at some point, and maybe it is generations off here, but we start to see a decrease in the age structure and eventually population changes. Like those places are going to be the first areas to recognize it, and everybody else, soon to follow if it's not managed. I think the hardest part for a lot of people, Jason, is like, seeing, like, obviously there's clear communication, between a lot of the states and coordinators and stuff, but it sure seems like everybody just does it a little different, right? Like Missouri's doing it different than Wisconsin, doing it different than Arkansas, doing it different than Pennsylvania. And I think there's a lot of maybe frustration in that for people to see, like, if we're all kind of dealing with the same disease, sure, it's a little different hunter demographics and how we have to deal with things, but it's like, how are we not like narrowed down on like, this is the approach after 10 plus years?
Well, not just the approach, but the result or the response. I mean, I don't know if I've ever seen like a, hey, here's what we did, and maybe that's because in Ohio here, like where we're most closely tied into, we just don't deal with it as much. But it's like on a reporting basis, you're like, here's what we've done, and here's the result, and here's the path moving forward.
Yeah, I think we definitely can improve, communication of what it is we're doing and what we're accomplishing from that. But you guys raise a great point, and I think it is one of the things that really confuses the hunting public to understand, like what exactly is it that we should be doing when you do see these very different approaches. And part of that, gets masked too, Arkansas, for example, be a state that sometimes gets criticized for doing nothing. Well, they are actually doing something. They're doing a ton of research, but then they're also recognizing that these places where they got really high prevalence, their ability to manage that prevalence is really limited. But they're doing work out in the periphery, when they're detecting additional positives, they're doing some of those similar things that we're doing. It's just that, the disease in Missouri is at a very much, earlier stage of introduction. And so our ability to, apply some of these management actions are pretty consistent. I think most of the wildlife management community, certainly not all, but, would agree on a lot of the strategies that need to be carried out. Then it's just the question of, do they have the capacity, social, political will, or even staff capacity in some cases to carry out those kinds of management actions.
Yeah.
We're fortunate to have a relatively large, MDC team, and literally everybody in this agency is involved in CWD management in one way, shape, or another. We got 1,800 staff members. Mm-hmm. My poor friends at the Mississippi Department of Fish and Wildlife got, I don't know, they're up to like 60 staff in their wildlife division, so just the ability to really dig in and implement those sort of management actions are constraints that are beyond, the individuals who are sitting in the chair. And then we deal with, the political realities of, having social and political support to take some of these management actions. And so it results in this what looks like a really haphazard approach. We have very different regulatory structures. But if you back it off, many of the states are doing a lot of the same sorts of kind of baseline things, carcass movement restrictions, baiting and feeding bans, in core areas, efforts to liberalize harvest. Those are pretty consistent. It's just then the question of whether they take that next step to do, winter targeted removals like we do and like Illinois does. Minnesota's doing a fair bit of it. Michigan's done, some of it. Like I mentioned, Arkansas is doing, some of those in targeted places. And so that cross-state narrative sort of gets lost. And in the last several months, a number of folks have been coming together to say, how do we as biologists start to better communicate sort of real consistently across our states, because information is at the fingertips of everybody, right? And so how do we better reflect what it is that we're actually doing? Indiana, for example, sort of set off a little bit of a firestorm in terms of, their detection in northwestern Indiana, and saying, hey, look, there's not much we're going to be able to do here. That was perceived in many ways as CWD management doesn't work.
Yeah.
No, when you're dealing with the overflow from a pretty heavily infected area, your ability to implement management that has a real significant impact is much reduced.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, do we spend our time and energy here? Or do we continue to try to do monitoring and surveillance in other places? But again, that nuance, that like stage of the disease is not all the same, and that decision making is lost on a lot of folks who aren't sort of entrenched and kind of really understand why Indiana made that decision. I don't disagree with them at all. I mean, we're having to make some of those decisions along the border with Arkansas. It's not pointing fingers at Arkansas. It's just that we got pretty high prevalence across the border. And so our ability to do these, kind of localized removals and stuff, and the impact that would have on the population versus the amount of time and energy it would take for us to do that, the return on investment's a lot lower than it is, finding a new positive in Ray County and saying, hey, this thing's an island out here, and we've only found a couple. Can we work there? So we're making those decisions, right? We're not shooting deer in every single core area that we have CWD. Perception might be that we are, but we're not. Mm-hmm. It very much is a prioritized and sort of attempt to be strategic.
Mm-hmm. The HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Sever.
Well, one of the biggest things that we always talk about is what our arrow setups are. And this year we're shooting the Sever broadheads. I think we're both shooting the new 2-inch titanium broadhead. And so, we're huge proponents of expandables. And I know we've had this argument back and forth with people, but we're right and you're wrong. And you just need to accept it. We just want to have a giant wound that pumps out blood. That's the bottom line.
We build our arrow setups and shoot bows, to maximize penetration. And we shoot broadheads that are going to give us the best blood trails, the most hemorrhage possible. And so part of those setups is we're also shooting the Easton arrows here coming up pretty soon. So we've shot the Victory in the past, and there's all kind of great arrow shafts on the market, but we're looking for a whole system from broadhead to arrow components to the arrow shaft itself. And the more we look at some of these Easton shafts and the components that go with them, that setup's going to be really deadly for us.
Yeah, I'm actually using the Easton traditional axis right now in my traditional setups for both my recurve and my longbow. I've got a 100-grain brass insert on those, and then obviously I'm using a fixed blade broadhead on those specific shafts.
Right on.
So, but yeah, our goal is always to be shooting the best broadhead that we think is going to be the most lethal for our setups. We've done plenty of research. We believe in the Sever broadheads, and we hope you would check them out at Sever Broadheads as well. Have you, at least in maybe some of these areas are different, you can look at Lynn and Macon being one. I mean, with the efforts that you've put in and kind of how things have happened, and obviously throwing in the curveball of EHD and stuff on occasion in those areas. I mean, do you guys think that the age structure has gotten younger in those areas? I still see and hear people killing, big mature bucks in a lot of these places. I mean, are there just that many, or were there that many on the landscape that we're just not seeing that effect yet?
Yeah, I think so. Probably numerically, would you say that there's fewer? Yeah, there probably are fewer, because in some of these places there's just fewer deer on the landscape. But in a lot of these places, there's still a lot of deer.
Yeah.
And the harvest pressure, I think, even today is much more evenly distributed across age classes. It's not like we've gone back to just only shooting spikes, right? So, so this, I think some of the hunter selectivity and some of the hunter preference, the focus on, passing bucks until you do see that larger antler buck still exist. And I think folks have become a lot more effective at targeting them through all of these tools. So yeah, there's no doubt they're still on the landscape. We're still killing some giant bucks, even in places where we have CWD. But again, it's at very, very low prevalence. And that's the other thing we face. It's like you raised it. We shoot 4,500 deer, and if 300 of them come back positive, then the 4,200 other were sort of wasted. Folks aren't seeing a lot of sick deer on the landscape right now. That's not the case in places like Wisconsin, in places like Western Kansas, when you talk to the biologists that deal with that on a day-to-day basis. Like I've talked to some of those folks, and they're like, at some point they almost feel sorry for some of the landowners. They're like, I feel like I ought to go buy this guy a box of shells and just drop it off at his house, because he has in fact had to shoot a number of sick deer that keep wandering through his property. And so we hope that not to be the norm, and it's just a real uncomfortable place for us to sort of be, that we have very low prevalence, and so you aren't seeing sick deer on the landscape, and that's the goal. I mean, that really is the goal.
If we look at the low prevalence, it's kind of like, let's say that is the success. Had we done nothing, prevalence would have likely increased in those areas. Is there anything in that you guys are doing in Missouri other than the targeted harvest efforts that could attribute those lower prevalence rates, or are we saying like, this is what we did as a management tactic, this is the result?
I think that's one of the things that we're also starting to talk about too, is how resilient is the population to the introduction of a disease. So we know that certainly population size and likely sex ratio and age structure probably play a pretty significant role in the way that, if the disease is introduced to a local population, how it's likely to spread. So there's certainly indications that the older the age class, the higher proportion of bucks in the population, the more likely that disease is to spread a little quicker through those populations. So I think that's also on the back end, one of those things where we've been on the younger age structure, continuum relative to some other states, and we've certainly been on the lower deer density continuum from a lot of other states. We've tended to have far fewer, overabundant deer population kind of issues than a lot of states. And so I think both of those things really contribute to, and that early detection contribute to having slower increases in prevalence and distribution of the disease on the landscape. We can't prove it, but I've always wondered what the impact of the buck actually was in Wisconsin on the spread of CWD.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There's certainly a density component to it, but they were protecting bucks because of the buck program. And we don't know. Right. So was that unintentionally making that population more susceptible? And so those are some of the things that as we continue to understand more about, this force of infection, the way that the disease spreads through the population, which segments of the population are most impacted, trying to build some predictive models to say, okay, if we adjust the sex ratio and age structure of the population and the density to this, what might the outcome be? And then trying to kind of do that, ground truthing through management action. So we're working with a number of states and with USGS, again, on this sort of, what's the management strategy here? Can we collect some data from different populations that have different sex ratios and age structures and have the disease, and what's that look like through time? And then could we manipulate some populations, or where are we implementing management actions that results in a deer population that looks different? Do we see different responses in those herds as a result of that?
Yeah.
So that's hard work, and it's a numbers game, and it's not easy to do, but those really are the things that folks are starting to think about as we recognize that it's not going away, and it's only going to continue to affect more of us. But how do we shift this paradigm to, it's here, what's the best way for us to manage for a healthy and sustainable deer population in the presence of CWD, like so many other, things that kill deer?
Yeah, I think it'll be, and it's kind of like the unfortunate part about it, but, you even look at Wisconsin where it's happening, or Arkansas where the prevalence is high. it doesn't seem like, hunting behavior has definitely changed a little bit, but I mean, people are still, you talk about Barber, he's still hunting there, even though he's killing deer and they're testing positive and stuff. I think even though we're seeing some of these, whether it's sick deer walking around and or decreases, and when we talk about like Wyoming and stuff like that, until stuff like that starts to happen in like what we would consider most whitetail hunters' backyard, they're just kind of numb to it. Right. The common thing that we hear all the time is like, well, I find all these deer dead from EHD. I've never seen a deer die from CWD. Right. I mean, that's the statement of the decade when it comes down to that.
No, it absolutely is. And, I've had the misfortune, I guess, of having many public meetings to talk about, CWD coming to a new area. And those conversations literally are like Groundhog Day, right? It's like, despite the fact that we've been talking about this for more than a decade, and I feel like we've been pretty open and communicated about it a lot. Yeah, a lot of those same things are, it's the same story over and over again, that we have to build the knowledge base, build the understanding, try to build, understanding of what it is that we're trying to accomplish. Because it's such a slow progressing disease, and it slowly filters through the population. It just does not operate in the same way that folks see on this real short timeline, an EHD outbreak. And so they're like, well, why are these guys worried about it? You're right. I find sick and dead deer. Well, it's that slow trickle. Yeah. And that's that look back 30 years from now and saying, man, if we'd have just killed a few more deer in 2010 or 2024, sitting here today in 2050, this population might look very different. I think that's the challenge. And, I've always erred on, right or wrong, the whitetail deer is a very resilient animal, and we can overshoot them and they can die EHD and they usually bounce back. Mm-hmm. So I'd rather err on the side of shooting a few too many too early than not shooting enough. Yeah.
I think the one thing that Seabury did bring up, which I thought was interesting, is that he believed that the death caused by CWD would not outpace reproduction. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there is some truth to that, right? And I think that's, again, if we think about, we had that conversation a little while ago about, when we saw deer populations increase, we saw a decline in fawn conception rates. Mm-hmm. You get to low abundance, you have a lot of nutrition available to those deer. They're likely to be healthy. I think we get increased recruitment and reproductive rates from younger individuals. Yep. So I think that's absolutely true. Again, if you draw this conclusion, CWD death rates greater than reproduction, if CWD death rates are greater than reproduction, you go to extinction. Right. Mm-hmm. If reproduction is greater than CWD death rates, you have a smaller sustainable population. And when they get to this age in which they're all infected, mm-hmm. and they're all going to die much quicker than they would have otherwise, you have less harvestable surplus, right? So there's less individuals that need to be removed from the landscape on an annual basis to maintain a stable population. Right now, in a lot of places, we would predict, anywhere from 25 to 30% of the adult females in a population need to be removed on an annual basis to maintain a stable population. Mm-hmm. If 75% of your adult females now have CWD and they're all going to die within a year and a half, you may only need to remove an additional 5% or 10%. Yeah. So that's where I think about, some of these places like South Texas, right? South Texas is a rainfall dependent system. In some of those places, if there's no rainfall and you shoot more does, you just got fewer does, right? Yep. It doesn't compensate for it. So that's what we're talking about. I don't think anybody believes that the deer are going to go extinct now because of CWD, because they can live long enough and can reproduce likely enough times to sustain themselves. Mm-hmm. But we're talking about sustaining themselves in the absence of harvest.
Pretty vulnerable population, though, at that point.
Right. It becomes very vulnerable for these other stochastic events that do lead to species extinction. But I don't think that's necessarily where we're at. Mm-hmm. But that's where we are from a hunting culture standpoint. You know, like if there are fewer deer on the landscape that can sustainably be harvested, the role of hunting is less significant for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting, man. You get down that pathway, and because Jared and I've had that conversation. It's like, well, what does that herd potentially look like? If you're telling me like the oldest buck in the herd likely is whatever 2.5 or 3.5 years old after pursuing mature deer for a long period of time, like how many guys just flake off the hunting scene because of that? And they're like, well, it's hard to go backwards at this point.
Yeah, it sounds shallow, but I mean that's the thought process. Is like, well, if you can't have mature bucks, then what's the point? There's certainly a meat element, but if
75% of them are infected, are you eating the meat?
Right.
Probably not.
Right. Yeah. So how do we continue to manage in a way that the deer can retain their most desirable characteristics, age and quality of meat?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think that's where we have to refocus the conversation is how can we work together to sustain this population through time, right? Let's not play the doom or gloom game.
Right.
We want to still have deer on the landscape. We want to be able to manage these populations and try to get out of the narrative of the reasons why the state agencies are doing what they're doing and all those stories that they get told about our motivations and all those kinds of things. I mean, I've dedicated a career to doing this kind of work. Last thing I want to do is destroy the whitetail deer population in the state of Missouri. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that is far from my motivation.
Yeah.
It is about, what are the really hard things that we need to be doing to maintain this population so many of us care so deeply about.
Mm-hmm.
And all those other things, quite honestly, are a distraction. The idea that we're only doing it because we get, federal funding to do the CWD research. Nobody's getting rich off of that. I'll promise you that. We've gotten 0 CWD research projects through the USDA grant funded program, and that's fine. Unfortunately, what the disease has done is forced us to, in an attempt to try to manage CWD, some of the PR, wildlife restoration related dollars that are generated through the excise tax are now being, spent on testing and spent on management actions for CWD and aren't available for us to do, a lot of the great habitat work that we've been able to do in the past. And then our staff are spending time, working on and managing CWD through all the winter months when they would have been doing, habitat work on the, million acres that we own and manage, or working with private landowners to implement cost share programs. So that it all has a consequence, and it is decisions that we don't take lightly at all. And it certainly isn't some money grab that we're trying to, go out there and get a bunch of additional funds. What we're doing, we're trying to get additional funds so we can continue to do all of the work of conservation.
I think it really circles back to, and we kind of beat it to death, but it's around this antlerless harvest side of things, is that when we talk about controlling populations and keeping things in check, like, there's one of the biggest ways to try to keep these populations in check and keep, sex ratios balanced and stuff like that. I mean, maybe it's 5% of hunters or 10% of hunters that could take this as a message to say, hey, listen, maybe you don't care about the whole, I want a 1-to-1 ratio for whatever, a better rut hunt or whatever it might be. But if you take it as a mission of like by harvesting those does that you're giving yourself and your property and your neighbors a really good opportunity to keep that herd in check. And if CWD happens to appear in that area, also keep that prevalence rate lower. Which again leans on the emphasis of like, we've got to figure out a way to make it easier for people to do something with these antlerless deer. Like that is, it's so beneficial to all of the public, right? I mean, think of the number of meals that are provided from hunters to needy families. It's like, it just seems like a giant disconnect there, opportunity wise for all of these hunters to say, yeah, I'll kill a bunch of does and I'm going to take them here. And then they're going to go out. All of this great high quality lean protein is going to go to needy families. Like that's it. That's success in a nutshell right there.
Well, that's the deterrent too, is that it's a lot of work.
Right now it is.
Right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So without processors, that would be the answer to that problem, which is, and so even on our farm, it's like, we shot 15 does last year, and it was a ton of work. And it wasn't like I only did it because I'm hyper incentivized to have a manageable population. Not from a ratio standpoint, but from a availability of quality habitat standpoint. I'm 1%. You know what I mean? Most people are not doing that. And like you said, the erosion of that ratio, like conversation is real because, Jason, we've talked to a lot of guys, a lot of good deer managers, and nobody knows. Nobody knows what the right ratio is. Nobody's got the right answer or a straight answer. And most of them are open about that. They're like, we don't know.
Yeah, this property we shoot a bunch of those. This one's we don't shoot any.
Yep.
We don't touch them.
Yeah, it just basically comes down to convenience. How many do you want to shoot? And that's that.
Yeah. Which property can I just drive the tractor to and roll them up in the bucket? Yeah, that's
exactly what it is.
And haul them out. I'm as guilty of that, right? It's like,
sure.
Yeah, that deer's on this side of the fence. If I shoot it right there, then I can just drive the tractor to it, or I can back the pickup to it, right? Like the convenience. Because, yeah, you're right. I mean, the number of folks who today are willing to shoot large number of deer are certainly declining. They are a much smaller proportion. And so that's why, we throw numbers at it, right? We throw, more hunters in the woods trying to get more folks to shoot deer. And so this, it circles right back around to some of the other challenges. And it's really about behaviors and desires and all those barriers that stand in the way of folks being able to shoot a large number of deer.
Okay. I've got an idea. You incentivize the purchasing of land by Amish communities in certain areas that you need a hyper, lots of deer shot.
They'll do it.
There's an off the wall idea for you.
They'll do it.
Bring them in.
Yeah. Man, I think it is, and again, it's that evolution of kind of how things have gone through time. Like even go back 15 years ago, I could take my doe to a processor. It might cost me $50 to get the whole thing processed, right? And now I haven't taken one to a processor lately that hasn't cost me $100 at least. And I bet it's even higher right now.
I haven't taken one in years.
Yeah. Well, they're also closing, right? There's fewer and fewer of them.
That's definitely true.
So it's like they can only take so many. There's fewer and fewer of them. Like, in an early season hunt, I know a lot of people won't shoot them in the early season, me included a lot of times because it's 80 degrees out. Like by the time,
and you don't want to screw up a buck hunt. That's the main deturn on an early season doe.
Yeah, or you have a chance of it spoiling. You just can't get it done fast enough.
Sure.
So yeah, all of those things I think play into this factor where it's like, with all the opportunities, Jason, you look at Missouri, all the opportunities and liberalizations that are there from a hunting side, like there are just fundamental obstacles that are preventing people from you could issue them, say, hey, you can kill 50 does next year. Nobody's going to do it, right? There's just obstacles in front of them that they just won't do it.
No, they just won't. You guys are absolutely right. Processors can't find help. It's our Share the Harvest program, I think, is, paying somewhere between $95 and $100, just to get a deer ground up and put in little packages, right? I mean, that's what those guys need to sustain that. And then on the backside of that, the food insecurity, things that happen, folks are, getting a lot more beef and pork processed at the local processor, wanting to know what's coming locally. And so, for a lot of them that are, an inspected facility or, sort of under some scrutiny of the local, Department of Agriculture, Department of Food, or whatever that might be, they got to shut down their operation and clean everything to process deer. Right. So it's only, in some cases, it's only worth it to them to do it on opening weekend or very narrow windows of time. And again, all those, sort of societal pressures that exist outside of what us and the wildlife management community can control. But that's where we do have to start to get creative and work with our partners from the Meat Processor Association and others, say what might be some of these unique and creative ways that we provide the opportunity for folks to, want either donate deer or expand their options to get deer processed, because it's real. And, we put up a real old school kind of printed out a map of the state. And one of the guys here started putting pins on the map of, where meat processors and where Share the Harvest processors were. And there's some huge gaps.
Yeah.
Absolutely huge gaps. And so it's a real challenge. And all of these things, we just kind of trying to tackle them one by one and figure out how we can best address them.
That's huge, man. I think similar to our conversation with Tonk, like if it's almost like a supply chain, like a distribution type of a question. It's like, how do we maximize the marketing of these locations and the incentivizing of, for people to be involved? I mean, I do think that there's ways to think about like a Dollar General, right? Like it's like they're everywhere. And you remember hearing about like potential integration or purchasing by Amazon. You're like, okay, how do we just maximize? So if you look at like, who are deer hunters, like, what are locations that they could have access to? It's like taxidermists, especially if their motivation is to buck hunt, then there's one. I don't know, archery shops,
Walmart.
Potentially, yeah, more mainstream things. But run down the list of places that could somehow be integrated into like a doe harvest or processing.
I mean, you need refrigerator trucks. That's the biggest thing. Like
refrigerator.
Yeah. If you have those, and you can just you've got somebody responsible to shuffle them in, right? And then that could essentially take them
like a pickup service,
a distribution service. Yeah, it takes them back to headquarters, right? Where
so you guys need to buy Schwann, the company. You need to buy Schwann. Schwann man's got to come pick up your doe. And yeah.
I mean, but it is probably
that'd be baller, right? What if you could check in on an app, just say, "Hey, I got 3 does that need picked up," and they'll be there within 24 hours, basically.
It's a huge problem. I think that has played into it.
Storage and transportation. Are the two biggest hurdles when it comes to that, and it's either transportation for the individual who's taking the deer, or it's transportation once that deer has been, taken to some kind of location. Then you got to figure out a way to store them and figure out how to get them to the other places. So it's the problem isn't super complicated. The solution is really hard.
That's it.
Right? I mean, it's like we can envision a path, but it's talking about industrialization of
that's exactly what it is.
Almost uniformly distributed across the landscape, right? I mean, we're talking about from border to border, right?
Yeah.
River to river. It's not like we're trying to figure out how to do this in a 2-county area.
No,
we're talking massive geographies in which something like this would, if even possible, would have to be implemented.
Wow. Yeah, I mean,
but some creative solutions are going to have to come forward, and some experimentation is going to have to happen to kind of get over some of these hurdles, because they're not unique, right? Yeah, Mike talked about it. We've got that same problem. You could talk to any of the other states, and
same thing.
And it's a real challenge.
What about just the post office? What if like MDC could have a program that's like, hey, you check in beforehand, and they send you overnight or whatever, like, you guys got the money, right? Send us a cooler with the dry ice and the means of like packaging a deer. And then
like
the post
an entire
office,
deer? Because most guys can't break down their own deer.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, got it. What's the basic level that guys can do? Got it.
Yep.
Put it in this box. Post office comes, picks it up.
Flat rate.
Do you know what I mean? Instead of like the actual...
I mean, they can't even like deliver my Amazon box, right?
Yeah, most of the time they do. I don't
know.
The overnight stuff is tough. It's really expensive.
Yeah, and it's heavy. It's a heavy item.
Yeah, it's a heavy item.
Yeah, we don't want to make a deer as expensive as Wagyu beef, right?
It's the trucks. You just need to have MDC refrigerator trucks at different locations.
I'm just trying to figure out how to leverage other partners. If the trucks are out there, I don't think that Schwann idea is a bad one.
They're going out of business, right? Nobody does that anymore.
Yeah, you probably get them for a steal.
Jason's
get a fleet of Schwann trucks. And,
that'd be good. I don't know.
I mean, generating some unique ideas. Let's just put it.
You're gonna pay. Yeah. We took away from this. You're gonna pay a bunch of hunters to kill does.
To load up Schwann trucks,
and then you're gonna load up Schwann trucks. I mean, that seems like the solution right there in itself.
Yeah.
And the phones are ringing at MDC.
Yeah.
Oh man. Well, listen, dude, we appreciate your time this morning and going through it with us. Obviously we've known each other for a while, and it's cool because we get to hear kind of the outside view a lot of times, and obviously I've a lot more inner working knowledge of kind of how you guys have operated for many years now, and even just other states as well. But it's good to have guys like you on to be able to really get into the nitty gritty of what the state's doing and how it's been. And a lot of them, they seem like complex questions, but they're not. It's like, well, why are we shooting all these deer in CWD areas? Well, we're trying to keep prevalence rate low. We are keeping it low. There it is. this is what happened. This is the result. And I think those are the simple things. Same with the rut and, gun season questions. Like, sometimes it's just, how it is. It's just getting the person out there to be able to talk to the general public and be able to convey that. Otherwise, it's, third-hand misconceptions, and by the time it gets to the fourth person, it's, completely twisted to where, an agency's just trying to kill all the deer because the insurance companies are paying them or whatever it is. So we appreciate it, man. I know it's valuable time, especially in your new position, to give us to have that conversation. And, I think our listeners will really appreciate it as well.
No, and I appreciate the opportunity. It gets heard differently when it comes through different platforms. I'm not naive to that, right? We can send out stuff with the MDC triangle on it, and folks may or may not even pay any attention to it. They'll make all kinds of assumptions about what it is and where it came from. And so I think these sorts of platforms are important, because I do think folks, when they tune in, are just listening in a different way, right? And so how do we communicate in those different ways where folks at least open their mind a little bit? And the other side of it is, I just always struggle with the presumption that we're not listening, that we don't care, that we don't understand, and that just couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, our team, and myself included, right? I'm not just sitting in the office tuning everything out that's happening in the world around me, right? I'm actively engaged in this community and care very deeply about the work we do, and it's complicated, and it's tough, and the decisions aren't easy, and they have consequences. And I mean, these are daily conversations that we have about what's the right thing to do. Could or should we be doing something different? Is there growing, distrust? I mean, that's part of, the background noise here too, is just sort of growing distrust of government and everything, right? The inundation of information. And so I guess I just appreciate the opportunity to come on and for you guys to allow us to have the conversation and ask all the hard questions that everybody else asks, right? I mean, it's the questions we all have. And I'm one that I very much believe communication from all of us is important. And so rarely, if ever, turn down an opportunity to talk to somebody who wants to talk about important conservation related issues. So thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
The HUNTR Podcast is brought to you by Quest Hunt Co.
Man, it seems like as technology and social media and stuff just gets incorporated into our daily lives in the deer season more and more, it's like we're always looking for ways to just dial it back, spend more quality time with deer hunters, and really make deer hunting and deer camps great again.
Yeah, and I mean, we've all been part of that annual buck pull, whether it's at your camp or the local fire department, and we're trying to bring that feeling back with Quest Hunt Co. to be able to compete against other people in your state, but also be part of a national competition.
You can sign up in as many states as you want to enter deer that at the end are going to get scored, and you have an opportunity to win some big prizes. And there's an in-person banquet in February that Jeremy and I are going to be at where those prizes are going to get held out. I think we're going to do some sort of whatever, live podcast or speaking. We'll figure that out. But just looking forward to spending time with people who sign up for the tournament.
Yeah, so you can go to Quest Hunt Co. and sign up. Use the code HUNTR15 at checkout. They'll save you a little bit of money, and then hopefully we'll be able to see you in Missouri in February of 25 at the annual convention.
To make this season a quest.
So, cool of Jason to come in and, the hard stuff is, and again, I guess that's what we have right now is prevalence when we talk about CWD. Like that seems to be the metric. It's either you have high prevalence or you have low prevalence or you don't have it detected yet. Those are the three options. Mm-hmm. I mean, per what they're doing, I mean, it's like, hey, these concentrated efforts, he related it to kind of like identify the tumor of cancer and like attack it, seems in their results to have kept prevalence low, which I guess is the equivalent of success.
Yeah, if that is the goal, I think they're still.
Is it not the goal?
Definitely not of everybody's. No.
What would be the goal then?
Just good deer hunting in the meantime, high population. So
yeah, but I mean, I feel like that's selfish, right? Because if you have good deer hunting for the next generation, and then 2 generations from now there are no deer, like,
well, a lot of people don't believe that would be the case. That's why, So MDC is saying, hey, the research indicates that we need to have a low prevalence rate so that we can continue to have sustainable herds in the future.
Yep.
Some people would look at the research or whatever, they know or are hearing about CWD, and they say, hey, it's not worth doing anything about. Or what they're saying is that what's the word? The solution is worse than the problem itself.
Mm-hmm.
So that's that. If there's a disagreement, that's where it's at.
I think we'll see it here soon. I mean, I would assume there's those places.
Just like COVID. If I relate it to that, it's like a lot of people would say, well, hey, a lot of people are dying from COVID. And then, but in hindsight, I think a lot of people would say, well, yeah, okay, that was happening and there was a problem there, but like the economic impact and of XYZ was far worse than, how it was dealt with was far worse than what actually happened. And whether that's
it's
the case or not, it's definitely subjective.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we'll see it. Again, I do think it's happening in Wyoming. That's the one place where I think age structure is young and populations are now on the fall in Wyoming. That's hard for, I think, most whitetail guys to manifest in their brain because it's just distant. It's mule deer mainly. I think Wisconsin, with its prevalence rates, some of those in the 40s and 50s, and Arkansas, we're going to see it here pretty quick. I think whether it's next year or 5 years from now, we're going to see age structures decrease. And at some point, maybe not in our lifetimes, so it might be in like my kid's lifetime, those populations start to drop pretty quickly as well. Because, I mean, that they're manifesting the prevalence rates to where if it's going to happen, right? So it's not a proven thing. If it's going to happen, that's where it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Because they're getting up there so high.
Yep.
Whereas, like, obviously in Missouri, prevalence rates are low. They're killing deer. I mean, it's one of those things where I don't know because I haven't experienced. Like, I'm sure if MDC comes into the farm next to you and shoots 200 deer off that farm, which it doesn't seem like they're doing, but
no, they are. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. No, that's what they're doing. Yeah. Yes.
It didn't sound like that. It sounded like it's up to the discretion of the landowner.
Yeah. And if the landowner's a farmer, he's going to shoot them all.
Okay. Shoots them all. Shoots 200 deer.
That landowner. The neighbor might say, no, I don't want any deer shot.
Correct. So so in the case, I guess I'm making the case of the solution is worse than the potential end result, right? So they're going to come in, they're going to kill 200 deer off your neighbor's property, which clearly affects you.
To them immediately, yeah, that's not desirable, of course.
Correct. I guess the situation then you're looking at for the following season is like you've got a lot lower deer population, right? And I mean, per Jason, in some of these cases, they're doing it year after year after year after year.
Yeah, 12 years.
It'll be interesting. I think the numbers there, and it's hard to visualize it, but like, how many are you taking off in those zones, right? Because I think he's saying overall it's like 4,500 deer. Right, and there's not core areas in every CWD area that they're shooting them, but in the ones that they are, it's 4,500 deer a year in that winter shoot. How many are you killing year after year? Is that representing that there's a sustainable population? You see what I'm saying? Like because this is the argument that Seabury made, and he's right, and Jason acknowledged it, is that like if I remove deer from an area, there will be more resources, the reproduction and everything will go up. That will affect the age structure.
Yeah.
Right?
For sure.
That's where...
It's a mitigation solution. Like nobody... the conversation we had with Seabury was probably the closest we had to what solves this. What Sumners is, in some other states via these targeted removal procedures, they're just trying to manage it, to make it manageable. But
there's no way Seabury even said it. There's no way this solves it. It's generations and generations and generations before there's enough. If this is let's say it is a completely resistant gene allele.
Well, you saw his answer to that. He basically resisted the research. He said, I don't think there's enough information to support it.
Which to a point I would agree. It's like, well, how do we know they don't die? Like I don't think I've seen that.
Well, that's where we should.
research.
Short of having him on at the same time, like you go back and review what he said about it. I'm pretty confident what he said was per our research, which you can try to poke holes in anything. We didn't conduct the research ourselves, and even if we did, there could be flaws. Was that I think he said 80% of them did not get it, did not contract the disease. About 20%.
If they were put in close proximity with it,
or no, given it direct, injected with it. That's what they did. They injected them with CWD.
We'll have to look at that.
And 80% of them did not get it. Yeah, listen back to it. Yeah, I mean,
we'll have to listen back because Tonk said that they get it. They're just, I know it takes them longer to die.
He don't know. He doesn't know about. That's different research. Seabury's the one that did the research. Yeah.
I don't know. We'll have to listen to that again because I don't recall that. I thought I recalled Seabury saying that.
Definitely, because remember, you thought before going into that conversation with Seabury, you're like, well, they still get it. And then distinctly, he's like, no, they don't get it. And I remember I looked at you and I was like, I mean, that.
I don't remember him saying that.
Yeah.
We'll have to listen to that back.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem is at the landscape level, it would take generations to
unless you bred them and released them into the herd.
But it still would take generations. That's what Jason's saying.
It'll take generations, but it'll expedite it.
I mean, thousands of years, probably.
I don't know. No. I mean, well, and I'm not saying this is my opinion. I'm just saying this is what Seabury said. Not that long.
Because I don't think he ran the models on it yet. That's what we asked.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's been a few weeks now since we did that podcast, but
it would benefit you if you had lower deer populations. It would happen faster.
For sure.
But most places don't have lower deer populations.
Sure. Yeah. And I don't know. There obviously is like some unclear consensus on the research. Some people believe it and some people don't.
Mm-hmm.
Regardless, what I'm saying, I guess, about the removal stuff is it's a mitigation effort. It doesn't, and we didn't even get into.
It won't get rid of the disease. It'll always be there.
Yeah, and we didn't even get into he's like, well, they spread it to each other, and that's true, but they also spread it to the habitat. Like it lives on.
Which is honestly one of the reasons why you'd want a mitigation effort is you want those carcasses removed from the landscape, not just dying in the wild and infecting the area.
Agreed. It's a hard answer. Number one, because the effects are unclear per what we were just talking about. So for a landowner, like if I'm the guy and they're coming and shooting hundreds of deer off all my neighboring property, it sucks. It's
it's off the charts. I mean, you're going to say this is bullshit.
It's not a good situation. Yeah. You're like, who knows?
Which is why I can't put myself in that position. I mean, if they did it next to one of my farms, I would say the same thing. This is ridiculous. I can't believe we're doing this.
You'd sell the farm.
Yeah, you'd sell it. You get out.
Yeah. So I think that was, and he did a nice job of addressing it. I mean, that is the answer to the targeted removal things that are happening in northern Missouri. That's whether you agree with it or not. I mean, that's how they're looking at it. The other one was the gun seasons during the rut. And I think just the frank answer there is that there's more stakeholders than just big buck hunters. And he's trying to,
I think they're
trying to give maximum opportunity. Case in point with the crossbow thing. Yeah. I do think there is, not that I understand it better, but we've talked to enough people, that's a classic, like, hey, opportunities.
Yeah,
opportunity
absolutely.
Keeps people engaged where
that's why they did it, was to give opportunity to older and younger generations.
And at some point here, these states are going to have to acknowledge the double-edged sword of that, which is that it is inherently limiting opportunity by reducing the quality of the experience.
I'm surprised. And I think,
reducing access at the same time.
It does reduce access, and he said that. It does reduce access. Yeah, he agreed with that. I do think the experience thing probably prevails still in Missouri because no baiting. It's those two in tangent that really start to erode that experience.
Sure. It's probably better.
Yeah, it's probably a better experience. I also thought it was interesting.
It is offset though by the gun season during the rut. I think that reduces their age quality.
2/3 of your deer hunters are gun hunters. I think that's why.
Yep.
They're not going to move it until that flip-flops, until it's 2/3 archery. Yeah. They won't move it.
Yeah, and that's fair. That's fair. If that's what it is, I'm not saying like Missouri needs to accommodate what I want out of the state.
I think that's the explanation for anybody who's wondering, like, why aren't they doing this? Like, how haven't they changed this yet? It's because 2/3 of your deer hunters are gun hunters.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. That's right. Yeah, and so, rather than, whatever, if that's what the state wants, then do it. But it is the reason that guys like you and I are just going to choose other states. Like if our goals are older age classes of bucks, like I'm going to go to, I put Missouri and Indiana like pretty much in the same.
I think Illinois and Missouri are in the same bracket. We just are fortunate enough to be in like really, really good soils where we're at that have the potential. But I mean, It's no different. It's a shorter gun season, which helps, but I mean, it's smacking the rut. It's the 15th or whatever. I mean, those deer are
similar, yeah,
rutting like crazy. It's very weather dependent on what happens. Crossbows during the archery season, right? I mean, $2 possibly in the bow season. Frankly, Illinois is even worse. Illinois is even worse than Missouri in that case. Yeah, I think those guys are very similar, except I bet if you did the numbers, there's more archery hunters than gun hunters in Illinois.
Maybe.
There's also less hunters overall in Illinois. Not by much, but it is less.
Yeah, well, and there's obviously pockets. You know, Illinois seems to have, and I'm sure Missouri does too. It's like, you know, the biggest deer are coming out of pockets of landowners who are
a lot of northern Missouri,
where the state's management has very little effect.
A lot of northern Missouri, big landowners, big pockets.
That's the cheat code. Is like if you can own enough land with enough people, it doesn't matter what the state says. You know what I mean?
That's
have
where the
ability
cooperatives
to control
are really
the resource.
paid off. I mean, we call them cooperatives, but it's just you and your neighbors being on the same damn page. And there's a lot of those in the northern tier of Missouri. Like, here's the hard part is like when we talk about how that happens in gun hunting in Missouri, like those guys in the northern part of the state are producing some really big bucks. Even though we talk to guys like Randy Birdsong, you go down in the Ozarks, I mean, dude, it's mountain deer down there. Not to mention now you've got leaching in from Arkansas and CWD into that area. I mean, those guys are they're killing bucks.
Oh, that sounds like somewhere I never care to be.
It's tough hunting.
Southern Missouri.
I've been down there.
Yeah.
It's tough terrain. It's tough hunting, and it feels
and small deer.
Feels southern a bit.
No thanks.
Yeah. So it's that's the broader landscape, and then in the middle you've got St. Louis, you've got Columbia, and you've got Kansas City. You've got these major metropolitan areas across the middle, and it's like it's a really tough segment. I think the hardest part I see from those guys is that, for the longest time, the northeast part of Missouri was where CWD was. That's where all the effort was. That's where all the focus was. If you look at that map, it's the better part of like the eastern part of Missouri now. And that's spread into some of even these urban type areas. That's going to be a handful. Like around where I lived in Columbia, that area is now in a CWD zone. I killed one of my biggest bucks in Missouri with my bow in the city of Columbia during like their urban deer program. So now you overlap CWD into that, and it's like, but and if you took the antler point restrictions away, I mean, there's no doubt that you're going to reduce the quality of deer in a lot of these CWD areas.
Yeah, it's funny, man. It's like these deer management discussions are very like landscape level, but like the reality is, they're individual creatures, and like you can see pockets and situations and different herds where it's just like, I mean, I've been on a few properties here recently in Pennsylvania that I'm like, this is better than our Illinois place. You know what I mean? It's just because it's whatever it is. It's a protected situation. It's like
secluded.
A lot of them are
resource.
urban and stuff. And so whatever. I mean, dude, you can find good deer hunting. Anyway, if you can get into those pockets and understand what produces those types of deer, that's what you're looking for.
Yeah, I mean the CWD thing is it's still as crazy as it seems. It seems like it's still such a far off mystery of how many years and money that's been spent on this thing. It's like, I don't think anybody really knows what the right thing is. We're assuming, and we're assuming that, or in a lot of cases, like what Jason was saying, it's like, hey, if we do these harvests and select shoots, the deer can respond to that. They can rebound to that. If we do nothing, maybe they don't rebound, but we don't know, right? Because nobody's gotten to that level yet. Once you're in that level, you're screwed. You can't come out of it. It's a black hole.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I emphasize with a lot of people who are like, well, like I don't think what we're doing is worth the effort right now compared to if we did nothing. And it's like, you might be right. It's very possible. Like if we did nothing, deer hunting would be what it is, and you might be right.
Yeah.
But if we fall into that black hole, then we don't know.
I don't know, man. You just got to make decisions. But I mean, I don't know. Maybe the answer is sell the farm. If the objective is, it's big deer and the MDC is coming and shooting them all, then like, hey, those are at odds with one another.
Yeah, you're not going to change
it. And it may not be the right thing to do, or it may be, and it just is what it is.
It's just like a bait state. It's like if you're in a bait state and they're not going to get rid of baiting, and you're only killing 3-year-old deer, better sell the farm, go to a non-bait state.
or start a podcast and try to change the rules.
Change the
if
world.
you're stubborn enough,
Change the world.
Change the world.
Yeah, but I mean that's just how it is. So yeah, I don't know, but yeah, cool conversation with Jason. We appreciate him coming on, and really cool to get involved and retouch on a lot of those things that we've been getting a lot of feedback from people on, and I'm sure at some point because there's big deer in Missouri, we'll hunt Missouri for sure. It's just and I've killed a lot of bucks in Missouri. I had good experiences there, but complicated. If anything, if you take that from that, it's just a super complicated. It's not as easy as just creating structures and laws. It's the psyche of the hunter and everything else involved in that, and the stakeholders, which oftentimes are far at odds with each other. But yeah, cool conversation with Jason. We appreciate him coming on, and we'll catch y'all next week.
Later.
Take me